The spring rain drummed against the weathered roof of Eleanor Wade's isolated farmhouse, a steady rhythm that masked the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly at her gate. 6 riders emerged from the mist-shrouded pines that surrounded her property, their figures dark against the grey Montana sky of 1899. Eleanor paused in her garden, arthritic hands still clutching a trowel, the newly planted herbs glistening with raindrops around her. At 72, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She appeared to be nothing more than a fragile widow tending her plants despite the coming storm. The riders couldn't see how her pale blue eyes sharpened as they approached, how her gnarled fingers subtly shifted their grip on the garden tool, or how her seemingly random position in the garden gave her clear sightlines to both the house and the barn. Those riders couldn't know that before she was Eleanor Wade, respected widow of Clearwater Valley. She had been Eleanor Shadow Fox Hudson, the most elusive outlaw leader the Western Territories had ever known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar cutting across his left cheek, raised his hand to halt the others at Eleanor's gate. His calculating eyes surveyed the modest homestead, the well-maintained 2-story house with its fresh white paint, the sturdy barn whose doors were secured with unusually heavy iron fixtures, the neat garden where the old woman stood watching. Then with apparent concern, "Afternoon, ma'am," the scarred man called, tilting his hat in a gesture of politeness that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Name's Victor Blackwood. My brothers and I have been riding since dawn. Mighty nasty weather coming. In wondering if we might trouble you for shelter in your barn until it passes." Eleanor straightened slowly, one hand pressing against her lower back as if the movement pained her. The other hand, still gripping the trowel, hung at her side. To the casual observer, she appeared to be an elderly woman, cautiously assessing unexpected visitors, perhaps worried, perhaps simply surprised by company in such an isolated location. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying the slight quaver of age. "No one should be caught in the open with this storm brewing. You boys are welcome to wait it out in the barn." Inside the house, 26-year-old Sarah Mitchell watched. Through a gap in the curtains, her heart racing, but her hands steady as they rested near the loaded Remington revolver on the side table. Unlike Eleanor's neighbors, who believed Sarah to be a distant niece who had come to help the aging widow maintain her property, Sarah knew fragments of Eleanor's true history. She had seen the hidden compartments built into the walls, glimpsed the collection of newspaper clippings Eleanor kept locked in a wooden chest, and most tellingly had witnessed Eleanor's transformation 3 months ago when 2 drifters had tried to rob them during the harsh winter. Before Sarah could even reach for a weapon, Eleanor had moved with shocking speed and precision, her frail appearance giving way to lethal efficiency. One drifter had fled with a bullet in his shoulder, the other never left the property at all. That night had changed everything between them. "There are things about me you should know," Eleanor had said afterward, her voice carrying a hardness Sarah had never heard before. "Things that mean you might not want to stay under my roof any longer." But Sarah had stayed. The daughter of a mining camp cook who had died when Sarah was 16, leaving her to fend for herself in a world unkind to women without protection. She had recognized in Eleanor a kindred spirit, someone who had built a life on her own terms, in defiance of a world that offered few options to women. Instead of leaving, Sarah had simply asked Eleanor to teach her to shoot as well as she had that night. Now, watching Victor Blackwood and his men through the window, Sarah moved silently to the position she and Eleanor had practiced, behind the heavy oak secretary desk that had been strategically positioned months ago to provide cover, while allowing a clear line of sight to the front door. Outside, Eleanor gestured toward the barn. "Help yourselves to the pump out back if you're thirsty." I was about to put coffee on, if you'd prefer something warm. Victor Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the elderly woman with unusual intensity. Unlike his companions, whose attention was focused on the coming storm and the promise of shelter, Victor seemed to be looking for something specific. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, swinging down from his saddle with fluid grace that spoke of a life spent on horseback. "Boys, take the horses to the barn. Franklin Mason, stay with them. Lyle Thomas, you're with me." The deliberate division of his men and the way his hand rested near his holster sent a clear message. This was no random request for shelter. Eleanor noted each man's position, their weapons, the way they moved in practiced coordination. These were not simple travelers or even common bandits. They operated with the discipline of men accustomed to violence and its application. "You have a lovely home, Mrs." Victor let the question hang in the air as he followed Eleanor toward the house. "Wade," she supplied, moving with the careful, measured steps of the elderly. "Eleanor Wade. My husband Thomas built this place. After the war, God rest his soul, he's been gone these 15 years now." Every word was calculated. The fictional Thomas, the timeline that placed her arrival in Clearwater Valley well after the Shadow Fox gang's final robbery, the suggestion of a long, uneventful widowhood. As she reached the porch steps, she paused, seemingly to catch her breath but actually to note the positions of all 6 men. 2 were leading horses toward the barn, 2 remained by the gate, and 2, Victor and a lean, sharp-eyed man she took to be Lyle, followed close behind her. "Wade," Victor repeated, testing the name. "Can't say I've heard of any Wades in these parts. Where did you and your husband come from originally, Mrs. Wade?" Eleanor's weathered face revealed nothing as she replied, "Pennsylvania originally. Thomas wanted open country after Gettysburg. Never did care for crowds." She turned her attention to the house, calling out as she opened the door, "Sarah, dear, we have guests seeking shelter from the storm. Put on more coffee, would you?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, her simple blue dress and carefully composed, expression revealing nothing of the tension vibrating through her. "Of course, Aunt Eleanor," she responded, her eyes carefully avoiding direct contact with either Victor or Lyle as she retreated toward the kitchen. Inside the barn, the man called. Mason was already examining the structure with professional interest. Unlike the typical frontier barn with its simple design, Eleanor's barn contained subtle modifications that would immediately strike anyone familiar with strategic defense. The stalls positioned to prevent clear lines of sight from any entrance. The hayloft ladder reinforced to hold far more weight than farm work would require, the absence of windows on the back wall where most barns would have several. "Franklin," Mason called softly, gesturing toward the unusually sturdy back wall. "Take a look at this." The broader man approached, his heavy brows furrowing as he studied the wall. "What about it? Notice anything odd?" "No windows, reinforced corners, and look at the seam here." Mason ran his fingers along a nearly invisible line in the wooden, blanking. "This ain't just a wall." Back in the house, Eleanor settled into a rocking chair near the fireplace, her movements deliberately slow and stiff. Victor and Lyle took seats at the kitchen table, their posture relaxed, but their eyes continuously scanning the room, noting exits, windows, and potential weapons. "Nasty business out at the Carson place last month," Victor commented casually, watching Eleanor's reaction. "Heard about that all the way in Silver Creek." Eleanor's rocking continued at the same steady pace. "Yes, terrible tragedy. Poor James and his family. This valley's always been peaceful until recently. Seems like trouble finds its way everywhere these days," Victor agreed, his voice sympathetic while his eyes remained coldly analytical. "A widow living alone in such an isolated spot must give you cause for concern." "The Lord provides," Eleanor replied simply, "and Sarah is a comfort to me in my old age." Sarah returned with coffee, her movements carefully controlled as she placed cups before the men. If she noticed how Lyle's eyes lingered inappropriately on her figure, she gave no sign. Victor, however, remained focused entirely on Eleanor, studying her with the intensity of a predator assessing potential prey. "Mrs. Wade," he began, setting his untouched coffee aside, "I'll be direct with you. Times are hard, and men like us look for opportunities where we can find them. We've heard stories about a widow in these parts who seems unusually comfortable despite her isolation." The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension. Eleanor's rocking chair creaked steadily, her aged face revealing nothing. "Is that so?" she replied mildly. "How interesting what tales will spread. I'm afraid you'll find nothing but modest comfort here, just what my husband's pension and good management provide." Lyle, less patient than Victor, stood suddenly and moved to the fireplace mantel, picking up a small polished wooden box that sat there. "Then you won't mind if we have a look at what's so important it needs to be kept in such a fine container?" Eleanor's rocking stopped. The abrupt silence seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. "Young man," she said, her voice still carrying the quaver of age, but now underlaid with something harder, "I suggest you put that down. My husband's war mementos have no value to anyone but me." Lyle's laugh was ugly as he shook the box, hearing contents rattle inside. "Sounds like valuable mementos to me, old woman." From the direction of the barn came the sudden crack of a gunshot, followed quickly by a second. Victor's head snapped toward the sound, his hand dropping instinctively to his holster. Thomas, who had been standing near the window, spun toward. The noise, his own weapon half drawn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside the house, no one moved for a long, stretched moment. Then Eleanor Wade smiled, a smile that transformed her face from that of a kindly old widow into something altogether more dangerous. "I was hoping we could avoid this," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, all traces of quaver gone. "But men like you never could take a hint." Victor's hand flashed toward his gun, but before he could clear leather, Eleanor moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her apparent age. The trowel in her hand came up and twisted, revealing itself to be not a garden tool at all, but the disguised handle of a narrow-bladed knife that had been concealed along her forearm. By the time Victor's revolver was halfway drawn, he found himself staring at the blade, now positioned with deadly precision near his throat. Lyle, momentarily frozen by the transformation he was witnessing, recovered quickly and started to swing the wooden box toward Sarah, intending to use it as a weapon. The young woman, however, was no longer where she had been standing. In the instant of distraction provided by the gunshots from the barn, she had moved to the position they had practiced dozens of times, the Remington appearing in her hand as if by magic. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, her gun aimed steadily at Lyle's chest. "I'm a better shot than I look." Outside, Thomas stood indecisively on the porch, torn between investigating the shots from the barn and whatever was happening inside the house. His hesitation proved costly as the front door burst open, revealing the tableau inside. The elderly widow standing straight and tall, a knife held with the easy confidence of someone intimately familiar with its use, while the young woman covered. Lyle with a revolver she clearly knew how to handle. "Drop it, boy," Eleanor called to him, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth dying for." Inside the house, Victor Blackwood's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. The transformation he was witnessing triggered a memory. An old wanted poster he'd seen in a Denver marshal's office years ago, showing a woman with piercing eyes and a confident smile, a woman the poster had named as Eleanor Shadow Fox Hudson, leader of the most successful gang of bank and train robbers the Western Territories had ever known. "Can't be," he whispered, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "Shadow Fox died in that shootout in Laramie. Everyone knows that." Eleanor's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect for a frontier widow. "Everyone knows a lot of things, Mr. Blackwood. Doesn't make them true. Shadow Fox Hudson," Victor Blackwood breathed, the name emerging with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. "The woman who stole 30,000 in gold from the Western Pacific Railroad and vanished without a trace." Eleanor's knife remained rock steady, her transformation from stooped elderly widow to commanding presence complete. The years had lined her face and silvered her hair, but her eyes now revealed the sharp intelligence and unwavering resolve that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in the territory. "That was a lifetime ago," she replied, her voice carrying none of the quaver it had held minutes earlier. "I left that name behind in 71. Outside, Thomas remained frozen, his inexperience showing in his inability to decide on a course of action. The silence from the barn following those two shots suggested Franklin and Mason had encountered something unexpected and likely fatal. Inside, Lyle Blackwood's survival instincts warred with his pride, the wooden box still clutched in his hands. As he measured the distance to Sarah, calculating whether he could use the heavy object as a weapon before she pulled the trigger. "I wouldn't," Sarah advised calmly, reading his intentions. "Mrs. Wade taught me to shoot center mass. Very little chance of missing at this range." "Listen to the girl," Eleanor added, her attention never wavering from Victor. "She's a quick study. Reminds me of myself at that age." Victor's mind raced through the stories he'd heard about Shadow Fox Hudson's gang, how they'd pulled off 7 major robberies without losing a single member, how they seemed to vanish like smoke after each job, how federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives had chased them across 4 territories without ever getting close. The gang had been famous not just for their success, but for their unusual composition. Eleanor had recruited women as often as men, flouting every convention of the criminal world. "You're supposed to be dead," he said finally. "The papers all reported you died in that shootout with the cavalry at Laramie Crossing." Eleanor's smile held no warmth. That's the story the army preferred to tell, rather than admit they'd been outsmarted by a woman. Again, the moment hung suspended in Eleanor Wade's parlor. Victor Blackwood, frozen in disbelief, his brother Lyle rigid with tension, and Thomas hesitating in the doorway as the rain intensified outside, washing away any possibility of easy escape. But before we reveal what happened next, let's consider what forces had brought these individuals to this precise moment of collision. Few people in Montana Territory in 1899 remembered the name Shadow Fox Hudson. 30 years is a long time on the frontier, where legends rise and fall with the changing seasons. Yet in certain circles, among aging lawmen who'd spent their prime years in futile pursuit, in saloons where old-timers spun tales of the West's golden age of outlaws, in the nightmares of railroad executives who'd lost fortunes, the name still carried weight. In an age when female outlaws were typically companions to male criminals, Shadow Fox Hudson had been something altogether different. She hadn't merely participated in crimes, she had masterminded them. She hadn't followed a man's lead, she had built her own operation from nothing. And most remarkably, when the inevitable end had come at Laramie Crossing in 1871, she had accomplished what no other notorious outlaw of her era had managed. She had truly disappeared. Or so they thought. The Blackwood brothers had come hunting ghosts and gold, drawn by whispers that had survived decades, rumors of gold coins of a particular vintage appearing occasionally in Clearwater Valley, coins that matched those taken in the Western Pacific Railroad heist of 1869, Shadow Fox's most legendary score. They had come expecting to find, at most, some connection to a long-dead outlaw, perhaps a relative who had inherited ill-gotten gains. Instead, they had found the legend herself, very much alive and still dangerously capable, despite her advancing years. What Victor Blackwood couldn't know as he stared at the transformed elderly woman before him was that Eleanor had spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment, the day when her past would inevitably catch up to her. The carefully constructed identity as widow Eleanor Wade, the strategic defenses built into her seemingly modest homestead, the contingency plans, rehearsed with Sarah, all of it designed for when, not if, someone came looking for Shadow Fox Hudson or her legendary gold. "Put your weapons on the floor," Eleanor commanded, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once led a dozen men and women through the most dangerous and successful robberies in Western history. Slowly, and then step back. Lyle's eyes darted to his brother, seeking direction. Victor gave an almost imperceptible nod, and both men carefully removed their revolvers, placing them on the wooden floorboards. "Thomas, come inside and close the door," Eleanor continued. "Sarah, keep your aim steady." The youngest Blackwood brother complied, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. What had seemed an easy opportunity, an isolated homestead, an elderly widow, rumors of hidden wealth, had transformed into a deadly standoff with one of the most notorious outlaws the West had ever known. "Franklin and Mason?" Victor asked, his voice betraying minimal emotion despite the circumstances. "They won't be joining us," Eleanor replied evenly. "My arrangements in the barn are quite effective." Sarah maintained her position, the Remington revolver steady in her hands as she covered all three brothers. Despite her youth, there was nothing inexperienced in her stance or expression. In the 2 years she had lived with Eleanor, she had absorbed not just shooting skills, but the calm, focus necessary to face lethal confrontation without panic. "Mrs. Wade, or should I say Miss Hudson," Victor began, his composure returning as the initial shock faded. "It seems we've significantly misunderstood the situation here." Eleanor's smile was cold as winter. "No, Mr. Blackwood, you understood the situation perfectly well. You came to rob a widow you believed defenseless. The only misunderstanding was about which of us was the predator and which the prey." She gestured toward the kitchen chairs with her free hand, the knife never wavering in the other. "Sit, all of you. We have matters to discuss." As the Blackwood brothers moved toward the chairs, Eleanor maintained a careful distance, decades of survival instincts preventing her from making elementary mistakes despite her apparent advantage. Even disarmed, 3 fit men posed a significant threat to an elderly woman if they chose to act desperately. "Sarah, retrieve the rope from the hall cabinet," Eleanor instructed, never taking her eyes off the brothers. The young woman backed carefully toward the hallway, maintaining her aim until she reached the cabinet. With practiced efficiency, she retrieved a coil of rope while keeping the revolver trained on the seated men. "Bind them," Eleanor directed. "Wrists first, then ankles to the chair legs." Victor Blackwood watched the proceedings with calculating eyes. Unlike his brothers, whose expressions betrayed anger and fear in varying measures, Victor's face revealed the analytical mind that had made him the leader of their small but effective criminal operation. "You must be quite a teacher," he observed, as Sarah expertly secured Lyle's wrists. "The girl handles that rope like she's been tying up men for years." "Sarah has many talents," Eleanor replied coolly. "Some taught by me, others developed through her own remarkable intellect. She's been an excellent student and a better companion." Once all 3 brothers were securely bound, Eleanor moved to the window, peering out toward the barn. The rain had intensified, sheets of water obscuring visibility beyond a few yards. Perfect weather for concealing whatever had transpired with the other Blackwood brothers. "Now then," she said, turning back to her captives, "let's address why you're really here." Victor straightened in his chair, wincing slightly as the ropes bit into his wrists. "As I said, we heard rumors—" "Stop!" Eleanor cut him off. "I've spent 30 years listening for certain kinds of whispers, Mr. Blackwood. The specific ones that might indicate my past was catching up to me. So tell me exactly what brought you to my door." For a moment, it seemed Victor might continue with evasions, but something in Eleanor's unwavering gaze convinced him of the futility of deception. "Gold Eagles," he said finally. "From the Western Pacific heist of '69, a saloon keeper in silver. Greek has been receiving them occasionally from a patron who trades at the general store in Clearwater Valley. Always the same vintage, always in excellent condition." Eleanor nodded, slightly unsurprised. "Carter Wilson. Drinks whiskey, plays fair at cards, talks too much when he's had 3 glasses instead of 2. The accuracy of her assessment confirmed what Victor had suspected. Eleanor Wade had maintained a level of awareness about her surroundings that went far beyond what one would expect from a reclusive widow. She hadn't just been hiding, she'd been watching, gathering information, assessing threats long before they fully materialized. "And you thought to follow this trail to its source," Eleanor continued. "Find the legendary gold that Shadow Fox supposedly disappeared with after Laramie Crossing. A reasonable plan under different circumstances." Thomas Blackwood, the youngest of the brothers, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We didn't come to hurt nobody," he protested, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of Texas. "Just figured, if someone had connection to old outlaw days, might be willing to share information for the right price." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Information at gunpoint is rarely given freely, young man. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending your intentions were anything but predatory." Sarah had taken up position near the fireplace, her revolver still. Trained on the brothers, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. The transformation in the young woman since Eleanor's true identity had been revealed was subtle but significant. Her posture straighter, her movements more deliberate, her eyes constantly assessing potential threats and advantages. She had clearly learned more from Eleanor than just how to shoot. "What now?" Victor asked, the practical question cutting through the tension. "You've captured us quite effectively, I'll grant you that. But what follows? We're not exactly in a position to trouble you further." The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. All those present understood the frontier reality. Dead men told no tales. Disposing of the Blackwood brothers would be the most efficient way to preserve Eleanor's carefully constructed life. "That depends entirely on you," Eleanor replied, taking a seat in her rocking chair opposite them, the knife now resting casually across her lap. "Unlike some, I've never killed without necessity." Victor's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Shadow Fox I heard about left bodies from Missouri to California. The Shadow Fox you heard about was largely a creation of dime novels and sensationalist newspapers," Eleanor countered. "They needed a villain spectacular enough to sell papers, and a woman outlaw leading men was too delicious a story to leave." Unembellished, she rocked slowly, the familiar motion at odds with the extraordinary conversation. "Yes, people died during our operations, when they chose to fight rather than surrender, when they made foolish decisions in the heat of the moment. But we never set out to kill. It was inefficient and unnecessarily complicated what were at heart business transactions." "Business transactions," Lyle repeated incredulously. "You stole over $100,000 across 7 territories. Eleanor's rocking continued, steady and unhurried. "From railroad companies that stole land from settlers using corrupt courts and private militias. From banks that foreclosed on family farms during droughts while their owners dined in Chicago mansions. From mining companies that worked men to death for pennies while shareholders grew fat on their labor." Her voice had taken on a harder edge, revealing glimpses of the passion that had once driven a young woman to choose a life outside the law, rather than accept the injustices she witnessed. "I'm not seeking absolution, Mr. Blackwood. I made my choices with open eyes and accepted the consequences they carried." But don't presume to lecture me on morality when you came here to rob an old woman." Victor studied her with renewed interest. "You're not what I expected," he admitted finally. "Few things are, in my experience," Eleanor replied. "Now let's return to the question at hand. What am I to do with you and your brothers?" The rain continued its assault on the roof, filling the silence that followed. Sarah glanced toward the window, where darkness was beginning to fall, the storm having hastened nightfall. Eleanor followed her gaze, making a quick calculation. "It's too late to ride for the sheriff in this weather," she observed. "Even if the trails weren't washing out, night travel in this storm would be foolish." "Sheriff Bannerman's out of town regardless," Sarah added. "Took a prisoner to Helena 3 days ago. Won't be back until week's end at earliest." This exchange of practical information, delivered with the casual familiarity of people accustomed to assessing tactical situations together, revealed much about the relationship between the two women. Despite their age difference, they operated as partners, each contributing to their shared security. "Then it seems we'll be enjoying each other's company until morning at least," Eleanor concluded, her gaze returning to the Blackwood brothers. "Which gives us time to consider all our options carefully." Victor's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes continued their assessment of the room, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. "And our brothers in the barn will receive appropriate attention once we've settled matters here," Eleanor assured him, "though I wouldn't nurture excessive hope regarding their condition." The implications hung heavy in the room. Whatever had happened in the barn, the shots they'd heard suggested a violent resolution rather than a peaceful capture. "You said you don't kill without necessity," Thomas pointed out, a tremor in his voice betraying his fear despite his attempt at bravado. "What makes this necessary?" Eleanor's rocking slowed as she considered the young man. Unlike his older brothers, whose hardened expression spoke of years spent outside the law, Thomas retained something almost boyish beneath his rough exterior. He couldn't be more than 22 or 23, likely following his brother's lead rather than charting his own criminal course. "That remains to be determined," she replied finally. "By your actions as much as mine." She gestured toward Sarah. "Check on our other guests, but be careful. The storm provides good cover for unexpected movements." Sarah nodded, moving toward the door with the practiced caution of someone well-trained in tactical awareness. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at Eleanor. A wordless communication passed between them, years of trust condensed into a single look. 10 minutes, Eleanor said simply. "Any longer, and I'll come looking." As Sarah slipped out into the storm, Lyle strained against his bonds, testing their security. The ropes held firm, expertly tied with knots that tightened rather than loosened with movement. "She won't make it to the barn," he predicted grimly. "Franklin and Mason aren't as easily taken as you seem to think." Eleanor's smile was thin. "Your confidence is misplaced, Mr. Blackwood. Franklin never saw what hit him, and Mason had just enough time to fire once before my arrangements rendered him equally incapacitated." Victor watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "You seem remarkably calm for someone whose carefully constructed life has just been exposed, Miss Hudson." Eleanor's gaze shifted back to him, assessing. "Mr. Blackwood, I've spent 30 years preparing for this eventuality. Did you think I wouldn't have contingency plans for when, not if, but when, someone finally connected Eleanor Wade to Shadow Fox Hudson?" The implication hung in the air. Whatever happened next had been anticipated long ago by a woman who had survived decades as one of the most hunted outlaws in American history. The Blackwood brothers had walked into something far more complex than a simple robbery opportunity. They had stumbled into the final chapter of a legend, a chapter Eleanor Hudson had been writing in her mind for 30 years. As lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white light for an instant, The full situation became clear to Victor Blackwood. They weren't just captives. They were now players in a drama decades in the making, pawns in a game whose rules and boundaries Eleanor had established long before they arrived. "What happens at dawn?" he asked, the practical question cutting through speculation. Eleanor's rocking chair creaked softly as she leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that belied her years. "That, Mr. Blackwood, depends entirely on what I learn about you and your brothers between now and then." The storm that engulfed Eleanor Wade's homestead showed no signs of abating as midnight approached. The wind howled through the valley, rattling windows and sending occasional debris tumbling across the yard. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of tension as captor and captives measured each other across the lamplight. Eleanor had moved the three Blackwood brothers to the kitchen, where they remained bound to sturdy chairs, but could at least be more comfortable. Then in the parlor's straight-backed seats, Sarah had prepared a simple meal, bread, cheese and coffee, which she offered to the brothers after Eleanor had inspected it. This small courtesy, extended to men who had come to rob them, spoke volumes about the code by which Eleanor still operated, even 30 years removed from her outlaw days. "You should eat," Eleanor advised Victor, noting his hesitation. "Tomorrow will require clear heads, regardless of its outcome." Victor studied the offered food before nodding to his brothers. They ate awkwardly, hands still bound, but with enough slack to manage the simple fare. Thomas, the youngest, devoured his portion with the enthusiasm of youth, while Lyle picked suspiciously at each bite. Victor ate methodically, his eyes never leaving Eleanor as he chewed. "Now then," Eleanor said once they had finished, settling into a chair across from them with the ease of someone accustomed to taking control of difficult situations. "I think it's time we understood each other better. You know who I was. I'd like to know who you are, beyond the obvious." Victor straightened slightly, the natural leader of the three. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, though his scarred face and watchful eyes revealed a hard path to that position. The jagged mark that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth had the distinctive pattern of a knife wound, one that had healed poorly due to inadequate medical attention. "What's to understand?" he countered. "We're businessmen who made a significant miscalculation today." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Businessman, an interesting euphemism for what you do. But let's start with basics. The Blackwood brothers, Victor, Lyle, Franklin, Mason, and Thomas, operating primarily in Wyoming and Montana for the past 5 years. Known for well-planned robberies with minimal violence unless resistance is encountered. Rumored to have connections to certain corrupt officials who ensure your activities receive less attention than they might otherwise." The accuracy of her assessment clearly surprised the brothers, though Victor maintained his composure. "You've been paying attention. As I said, I've spent 30 years listening for certain kinds of whispers," Eleanor replied. "Your operation has been careful enough to avoid significant attention from federal marshals, but careless enough that tales of your exploits reach even a reclusive widow's ears eventually." This revelation that Eleanor had monitored criminal activities throughout the region from her isolated homestead suggested resources and connections far beyond what anyone might expect from a retired outlaw. She hadn't merely been hiding. She had maintained an intelligence network that kept her informed of potential threats long before they materialized. Victor Blackwood seemed to reach a decision. "If we're to have this conversation, let's have it honestly. We are what we are, men who take what we want and make no apologies for it. The West is changing, civilization encroaching year by year. The opportunities for men like us grow more limited with each new railroad and telegraph line." "So you came hunting legends," Eleanor observed. "The last great score before progress closes all the doors." Victor inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of her assessment. The Western Pacific gold has never been recovered. 30,000 in double eagles, untraceable and negotiable anywhere. A fortune that would allow men to establish legitimate enterprises, perhaps in places where questions about origins are asked less frequently. Mexico, Eleanor suggested. Or perhaps Canada, somewhere the Blackwood name isn't connected to robbery and murder. A slight tightening around Victor's eyes was the only indication that her insight had struck home. Plans change based on circumstances. Currently, our circumstances seem rather limited. Eleanor studied him with the practiced eye of someone who had once evaluated potential gang members, separating those with genuine talent from those merely drawn to the romance of outlaw life. Victor Blackwood, despite his current predicament, displayed the calculated thinking and psychological control that marked capable leadership. "Tell me about your brothers," she said, changing tack abruptly. "Each man comes to this life through his own path." Victor hesitated, clearly weighing the strategic value of personal disclosure against potential disadvantages. Finally, he shrugged slightly. "Lyle and I were born to it. Our father rode with the James Younger gang for a time, before establishing his own operations in Kansas. He taught us the trade from childhood, how to assess targets, plan approaches, evaluate risks. Franklin and Mason are cousins who joined us after the drought of '91 took their family farm in Nebraska. Thomas is our half-brother from our father's second marriage. He's been with us only 2 years. This family history, delivered with matter-of-fact precision, illuminated much about the Blackwood operation. Unlike many outlaw gangs that formed haphazardly around charismatic leaders, theirs was essentially a family business, built on blood ties and shared experience. Lyle Blackwood shifted in his chair, the movement drawing attention to his distinctive appearance. Unlike Victor's weathered ruggedness, Lyle possessed a deceptively refined quality, handsome features, carefully trimmed mustache, and the bearing of someone who might pass for a businessman or gambler in more civilized settings. At 37, he showed fewer physical signs of their harsh lifestyle, suggesting he played a role that required a more respectable appearance. "Victor forgets to mention my particular contributions," Lyle remarked, speaking directly to Eleanor for the first time since their meal began. "I handle our intelligence gathering and public interactions. Banks and businesses tend to be more forthcoming, with well-dressed gentlemen inquiring about investment opportunities than with obvious roughnecks." The hint of cultured accent in his speech confirmed Eleanor's assessment. Lyle was the face of their operation, the one who could move through respectable society, gathering the information necessary for successful robberies. "The reconnaissance man," Eleanor acknowledged. "Every successful operation needs one. In my day, that role was filled by Catherine Mills, a banker's daughter from St. Louis, who could charm information from the most tight-lipped officials while appearing to do nothing more than consider opening an account." This rare personal detail about the Shadow Fox gang's operations seemed to intrigue the brothers. Even Victor leaned forward slightly, his interest in the legendary outlaw temporarily overcoming his concern about their current predicament. "And what happened to Miss Mills?" he asked. "After Laramie Crossing?" A shadow passed across Eleanor's face, the first crack in her composed facade. "Catherine died 3 years before Laramie. Pneumonia took her in the winter of '68. A remarkably mundane end for someone who had escaped shotgun blasts and Pinkerton agents for 5 years. The genuine regret in her voice revealed an aspect of Eleanor Hudson that contrasted with her legendary status, not just a calculating outlaw leader, but a woman who had formed deep bonds with her companions. Thomas Blackwood, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchanges, spoke up suddenly. "Did you really recruit women into your gang? The stories say you had almost as many female members as men." His youthful curiosity seemed genuine, suggesting that despite riding with his brothers, Thomas retained a certain innocence about their profession, perhaps even a touch of the romanticism that dime novels had attached to the great outlaws of earlier decades. Eleanor's expression softened slightly as she regarded the young man. No more than 22, Thomas lacked the hardened demeanor of his older brothers. His features still carried traces of boyishness beneath the stubble and trail dirt, and his eyes held a questioning quality rather than the calculating assessment that characterized Victor's gaze. "Not as many as the stories claim," Eleanor replied, "but yes, several of my most valuable associates were women. In that era, women were largely invisible to law enforcement, or at least women of certain appearances and apparent social positions were. A well-dressed lady could observe bank security procedures for weeks without raising suspicion, while a man loitering for even a day might be questioned." This strategic insight, leveraging society's blindness toward women to criminal advantage, revealed the innovative thinking that had made the Shadow Fox gang so successful in their era. Eleanor Hudson hadn't merely been brave or lucky, she had recognized and exploited systemic weaknesses that her male counterparts overlooked. "And what about the brothers in the barn?" Eleanor asked, shifting attention back to the immediate situation. "Tell me about Franklin and Mason." Victor's expression hardened slightly at the reminder of his separated siblings. "Franklin is the strongest among us. Former prizefighter in Chicago before the law, they became too interested in his activities. Simplifies problems with his fists when diplomacy fails. And frequently before diplomacy has been fully attempted," Lyle added, with evident disapproval. "His impatience has complicated more than one operation." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Every gang had its muscle, the members whose primary value lay in physical intimidation rather than strategic contribution. In her own operation, that role had been filled by the Swenson brothers, Swedish immigrants whose imposing size had often precluded the need for actual violence. Few bank managers required further persuasion when confronted with men who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall. "Mason is our tracker and scout," Victor continued. "Learned his skills from a Crow guide during his time with the Army. Dishonorable discharge in '89 after a disagreement with a lieutenant that left the officer with a permanent limp. Can read sign better than most Indians and knows territory from the Dakota Plains to the Bitterroot Mountains." This description completed Eleanor's understanding of the Blackwood operation. A well-balanced team with complementary skills, bound by family ties that prevented the internal betrayals that often destroyed other outlaw gangs. Victor provided leadership and planning, Lyle handled intelligence and public interactions, Franklin offered physical enforcement, Mason contributed wilderness skills and tracking, while Thomas, still learning, likely served as an extra gun and general assistant. "A capable group," Eleanor acknowledged, "which makes your decision to target this particular homestead all the more interesting. Experienced men like yourselves should have recognized the unusual aspects of my property, the strategic positioning, the excessive security features, the careful maintenance of sightlines. Yet you proceeded as if approaching a standard widow's farm." Her observation cut to the heart of the matter. What had driven competent criminals to overlook obvious warning signs? Victor and Lyle exchanged a glance that suggested this question touched on internal disagreements. Mason raised concerns, Victor admitted finally. "Noted several unusual features during our preliminary observation. I overruled him." "Why?" Eleanor pressed, genuinely curious about the tactical miscalculation. Victor's scarred face revealed little, but his words carried the weight of uncommon honesty. "Because the potential reward seemed worth the risk. 30,000 in gold eagles would allow us to establish legitimate businesses far from territories where our names carry reputations." With civilization encroaching year by year, the window for men of our profession grows smaller. We needed one final score significant enough to build new lives upon. This frank acknowledgement of their motivations, not mere greed, but a recognition of changing times, suggested a self-awareness that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The Blackwood brothers weren't simply predators. They were men who recognized that their way of life was ending and sought an exit strategy, however misguided their methods. "A sentiment I understand better than you might imagine," Eleanor said, after a thoughtful pause. "It was similar reasoning that led me to establish this homestead after Laramie Crossing. The West of 1871 was already changing from the frontier I had known in the 1860s. Telegraph lines connected previously isolated settlements. Railroads brought law enforcement within days rather than weeks of crime scenes, and newspapers spread descriptions and warnings with unprecedented speed." Sarah, who had been maintaining a watchful position near the door throughout these exchanges, spoke for the first time in over an hour. "The storm's intensity is decreasing," she observed, her practical assessment cutting through the increasingly philosophical conversation. "First light will come in about 5 hours." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging both the information and its implications. "Thank you, Sarah. We should all get some rest before decisions must be made." Victor straightened in his chair, ignoring the discomfort of his bonds. "And what decisions might those be, Miss Hudson? Our fate remains conspicuously undiscussed." Eleanor rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested sudden changes after decades of hard use. Despite this concession to age, her posture remained commanding, her eyes sharp with intelligence undiminished by her 72 years. "Several options present themselves," she replied evenly. "None without complications. Sheriff Bannerman returns in 3 days. Delivering you to him would be the most straightforward approach, though it would inevitably raise questions about how an elderly widow and her niece managed to capture 5 experienced outlaws. The implication hung in the air. Turning the Blackwood brothers over to legal authorities would likely expose Eleanor's own identity, unraveling the life she had carefully constructed over 3 decades. "Alternatives exist, of course," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "Remote locations offer privacy for permanent solutions to temporary problems. My property includes several areas where soil composition facilitates both digging and subsequent vegetation growth." This calm reference to the possibility of execution and burial should have been chilling, yet Eleanor delivered it with such practical detachment that it seemed more like a farmer discussing crop rotation than a former outlaw contemplating murder. "Or," Victor prompted, correctly sensing that Eleanor had not finished outlining possibilities. "Or arrangements might be reached," she concluded. "Terms that would allow all parties to pursue their interests with minimal interference. My continued peaceful existence here, your departure toward whatever futures you envision for yourselves." This third option, a negotiated resolution rather than either legal consequences or frontier justice, revealed Eleanor's pragmatic approach to conflict resolution. Despite her legendary status and the brothers' criminal intent, she remained open to solutions that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. "Such arrangements would require trust," Victor observed, skepticism evident in his tone. "A commodity in short supply under current circumstances." Eleanor's smile held no warmth. "Trust is indeed rare in our profession, Mr. Blackwood, but effective mechanisms exist to enforce agreements even among those who might otherwise be inclined to betrayal." With that cryptic statement, she nodded to Sarah, who moved toward the brothers with a small bottle and cloth in hand. "A mild sedative," Eleanor explained as Sarah prepared to apply the dampened cloth to Thomas's face. "Nothing harmful, merely enough to ensure you remain where placed until morning. We all need rest, and I prefer not to have my sleep disturbed by ill-advised escape attempts." Thomas's eyes widened with alarm, but before he could protest, Sarah pressed the cloth firmly over his nose and mouth. His struggles lasted only seconds before his eyes rolled back and his head slumped forward. Dreams without complications. Eleanor observed as Sarah moved to repeat the process with Lyle, something we all might wish for in different circumstances. Victor watched his brothers succumb to the sedative without resistance, recognizing the futility of struggle against their bonds. As Sarah approached him with the cloth, he met Eleanor's gaze directly. "You've led an extraordinary life, Shadow Fox," he said, using her legendary name for the first time. "I wonder if you'll allow me the opportunity to hear more of it, assuming morning brings decisions in our favor." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable as she considered this request. Part flattery, part genuine curiosity, delivered by a man facing an uncertain fate at her hands. "Sleep well, Mr. Blackwood," she replied simply. "Morning brings clarity to even the most complex situations." As the cloth descended over Victor's face, the last thing he saw was Eleanor Hudson silhouetted against the lamplight, the legendary Shadow Fox emerging fully from beneath the careful disguise of Eleanor Wade, a transformation 3 decades in the making, precipitated by his own misjudgment and ambition. Outside, the storm began to subside, the wind's howl diminishing to an occasional moan as the worst of the tempest moved eastward across the Montana plains. By dawn, the skies would clear, bringing sunshine and decision to Clearwater Valley and to the unusual gathering within Eleanor Wade's farmhouse. Long after the Blackwood brothers had succumbed to the sedative, Eleanor Wade sat alone in her parlor, a single lamp burning low as the storm gradually subsided outside. Sarah had finally relented to Eleanor's insistence that she get some rest, though the young woman had extracted a promise that Eleanor would wake her in 2 hours to take the watch. In this rare moment of solitude, Eleanor allowed herself to do something she seldom permitted. She revisited the past. From beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, concealed by a heavy rug, she retrieved a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The box had been her one indulgence when establishing her new identity, a single object carried from her previous life into her careful anonymity as Eleanor Wade. The key hung on a chain around her neck, never removed even when bathing. With practiced movements, she unlocked the box and spread its contents on the small table beside her rocking chair, a collection of faded newspaper clippings, a folded wanted poster, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal whose pages had yellowed with age. The wanted poster, unfolded carefully to prevent further damage along its well-worn creases, revealed an artist's rendering of a woman in her early 30s. Despite the primitive printing techniques of the era, the image captured a striking figure, high cheekbones, determined eyes, and a confident half-smile that suggested the subject found something privately amusing about having her likeness distributed by authorities. "Wanted dead or alive, Eleanor Shadow Fox Hudson," the bold text proclaimed, "for robbery, theft of federal property, conspiracy, and aiding known criminals. $5,000 reward." The sum, extraordinary for the 1860s, testified to how desperately law enforcement had wanted to capture the legendary female outlaw. Eleanor studied the image with the detached curiosity of someone examining a distant relative, rather than a younger version of herself. The decades separating Shadow Fox Hudson from Eleanor Wade had transformed her physically. Silver hair replacing the chestnut waves, wrinkles mapping a lifetime of expression across once smooth skin, hands gnarled by both arthritis and the practical work of maintaining a frontier homestead. Yet the eyes remained unchanged, perceptive, alert, and carrying a hint of the sardonic humor that had made her both a charismatic leader and a frustrating quarry for those who pursued her across 7 territories for nearly a decade. Eleanor turned her attention to the journal, opening it to an entry dated June 17, 1869, 2 months before the Western Pacific Railroad heist that the Blackwood brothers had come seeking. The handwriting was precise and compact, making efficient use of space in a manner that reflected the writer's methodical mind. Reconnaissance of Western Pacific route completed. Jefferson confirms gold shipment scheduled for August 12th. 24 crates, each containing approximately $1,250 in double eagles, to be transported from Sacramento to Chicago via the new Northern Line. Security arrangements standard for valuables. 2 company guards plus messenger in specialized car. No military. Escort planned. Catherine suggests ambush at Rattlesnake Pass, where maintenance work will necessitate reduced speed. Riley's concern about terrain, valid but manageable, will require precise timing and complete telegraph interruption to prevent advance warning. To Fort Harrison. Decision. Proceed with planning. Catherine to obtain shipping manifests through bank contacts. Daniel to survey pass for optimal positioning. Henry to procure necessary equipment from Salt Lake City supplier. Preliminary arrangements to be completed by July 20th for final review. This clinical assessment of what would become the most famous robbery in Western history revealed nothing of moral quandary or concern for potential consequences, only the dispassionate planning of a tactical mind applying itself to a complex problem. The entry might as easily have been written by a military commander planning a campaign as by an outlaw leader organizing a major theft. Eleanor turned to a later entry, dated August 15, 1869, 3 days after the robbery. Operation executed according to plan with minimal complications. Telegraph lines cut at 9:17 p.m., delaying alert until repair at approximately 2 a.m. Train arrived at Pass at 10:42 p.m., 7 minutes behind schedule but within acceptable parameters. Maintenance signal properly recognized by engineer, reducing speed to 12 miles per hour as anticipated. Boarding accomplished without incident from North Embankment. Guards subdued using chloroform as planned. No casualties. Messenger initially resistant, but cooperative after demonstration of overwhelming force. All 24 crates secured and removed via pack horses to Cottonwood Creek Rendezvous. Team divided as established in contingency plan Hawthorne. 6 groups of 3 taking separate routes to secondary gathering point at Henderson's abandoned mining claim. Minor injury to Riley, bullet grazed to left arm, when messenger produced. Hidden derringer. Wound cleaned and bandaged, no significant blood loss. Catherine administering laudanum to manage pain during travel. Estimated total $29,150 in double eagles, roughly 1,500 coins. Weight distribution per person approximately 14 pounds. Successfully transported to holding location for 6-month cooling period as established in protocol. No pursuit detected as of this writing. Telegraph reports indicate confusion about direction of travel, with posses dispatched both north and south along rail line. Misdirection efforts appear successful. The precise account, devoid of both self-congratulation and concern about legal consequences, illuminated the methodical approach that had made the Shadow Fox gang so successful. Where other outlaws relied on brute force and intimidation, Eleanor Hudson had applied strategic planning and intelligence gathering worthy of a military campaign. Most tellingly, the entry reflected her operational principle of avoiding casualties. Whenever possible, not from moral compunction alone, but from the practical recognition that dead bodies created more determined pursuit than simple property theft. Eleanor closed the journal, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. These pages contained the only accurate record of the Shadow Fox gang's operations, a stark contrast to the sensationalized accounts that had appeared in newspapers and dime novels of the era. She had maintained the journal throughout her outlaw years, recording each operation with the same dispassionate precision, creating an archive that would have been devastatingly incriminating had it ever fallen into law enforcement hands. Why had she kept it? The question had occurred to her many times over the decades, especially in the early years of establishing her new identity, when discovery would have meant certain execution. The journal represented an inexplicable risk for a woman otherwise so carefully calculated in her actions. Perhaps it was vanity, a desire to preserve the reality of her accomplishments against the distortions of popular mythology. Perhaps it was a form of reckoning, an honest accounting of actions that could neither be undone nor fully atoned for. Or perhaps, most simply, it was a connection to the woman she had been before necessity transformed her into the respectable widow of Clearwater Valley. A soft sound from the kitchen drew Eleanor's attention back to the present. Rising with the careful movements of age, she secured the journal and clippings in their box, returned it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, and moved silently toward the source of the noise. Thomas Blackwood was regaining consciousness, his head lolling as he struggled against the lingering effects of the sedative. Unlike his brothers, who remained deeply unconscious, the younger man's system had apparently processed the drug more quickly. His eyes, still unfocused, tracked slowly around the kitchen until they settled on Eleanor, standing in the doorway. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then retrieved a cup from the sideboard and filled it from the pitcher. She approached cautiously, holding the cup to his lips while maintaining sufficient distance to prevent any sudden movement on his part. From reaching her, Thomas drank greedily, water spilling down his chin in his eagerness to relieve his parched throat. When he had finished, Eleanor stepped back, assessing him with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "Thank you," he managed, his voice stronger though still raspy from the drug. "You're welcome," Eleanor replied, simply. "The effects will fade completely within the hour. Your brothers will likely remain unconscious until dawn." Thomas nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. "Why am I awake when they're not?" A reasonable question, suggesting a mind that remained analytical despite his circumstances. "Younger metabolism, perhaps," Eleanor suggested, "or possibly a higher tolerance for soporifics. The body responds differently based on previous exposures." The young man's expression revealed surprise at her scientific knowledge. Another incongruity in this elderly widow, who had proven to be so much more than she appeared. "How did you become Shadow Fox?" he asked suddenly, the directness of youth cutting through pretense. "The stories never say where you came from, only what you did." Eleanor considered him thoughtfully. Of all the Blackwood brothers, Thomas alone had shown genuine curiosity beyond their immediate circumstances, interest in the person behind the legend rather than merely the gold they had come seeking. Whether this reflected youthful romanticism or deeper insight into human complexity remained unclear. "A question seldom asked, even by those who hunted me for years," she observed, settling into a chair opposite him but maintaining a cautious distance. They were content to chase the outlaw without wondering how she came to exist. Thomas waited, his expression open with genuine interest despite his bound condition. Something in his unguarded curiosity reminded Eleanor of another young person long ago, a version of herself before circumstances had hardened her into the woman who would become Shadow Fox Hudson. "I was born Eleanor Grace Sullivan in 1827, she began, surprising herself with the decision to share this long-buried history. Daughter of Judge William Sullivan of Boston, Massachusetts, a respected family of moderate wealth and significant social standing. This origin, far removed from the frontier settings most associated with outlaw origins, clearly surprised Thomas. The Shadow Fox of legend had seemed so intrinsically connected to the Western territories that few had imagined her having roots in Eastern civilization. "My father believed in education for women," Unusual for that time, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the cadence of long untold stories, finally finding voice. I studied mathematics, history, philosophy, and languages alongside my brothers. Father always said an educated mind was the greatest asset in navigating life's complexities. He couldn't have anticipated how I would eventually apply those lessons. She paused, lost momentarily in memories of a life so distant it sometimes seemed to belong to another person entirely. I married Charles Hudson at 22, a banker's son with progressive ideas and a restless spirit. When gold was discovered in California in 1849, Charles was among the thousands who headed west seeking fortune. Unlike most, he insisted I accompany him rather than wait safely in Boston. Thomas's expression reflected growing interest as Eleanor's story diverged increasingly from the typical outlaw narratives of desperate poverty or youthful criminality. "Did you find gold?" he asked. Eleanor's smile held little humor, not in the way most seekers imagined. Charles established a small but successful assay office in Sacramento, a natural application of his banking knowledge. We built a comfortable life there, away from Boston's stifling social constraints. For 5 years, we prospered as California transformed from wilderness to a center of commerce. Her expression darkened. Then came 1855. The Sacramento River Banking Company failed after its president embezzled nearly all depositor funds. Charles had invested heavily in the institution, trusting the friendship of men he'd known since childhood. We lost everything: our savings, our business, our home. When Charles confronted James Whitford, the bank's president, about the lost funds, he was found the next morning in an alley with his skull crushed. The official finding was robbery gone wrong, despite the fact that his watch and wallet remained untouched. The bitter edge in her voice revealed that even after more than 4 decades, the wound of this betrayal remained unhealed. The local sheriff showed remarkable disinterest in pursuing alternative explanations, particularly after Whitford made a substantial donation to the county building fund the following week. This origin story, personal tragedy compounded by institutional corruption, illuminated the foundation upon which Shadow Fox Hudson had built her criminal career. Not simple greed or lawlessness, but a profound disillusionment with the systems, supposedly designed to protect honest citizens. I spent 6 months attempting to work within legal channels, Eleanor continued. Petitioned the governor, hired lawyers, even traveled to San Francisco to meet with federal officials. Each effort met the same response: polite sympathy followed by inaction. Meanwhile, Whitford and his associates continued to prosper, opening new businesses with funds stolen from hundreds of depositors who, unlike Charles, had survived to face poverty. Thomas listened intently, the romantic notions of outlaw glory clearly fading as he confronted the harsh realities that had shaped Eleanor's choices. "So you decided to take justice into your own hands?" Eleanor nodded slightly. "Not immediately. First came survival. I worked as a schoolteacher in mining camps, then as a bookkeeper for a freight company. I learned the territories, observed how money and valuables moved through increasingly organized channels. Most importantly, I watched how power operated. On the frontier, how certain men prospered not through honest labor, but through manipulation of emerging systems, often with the complicity of those tasked with enforcing justice. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes reflecting the intensity that had once made her a natural leader of desperate men and women. The Western territories in the 1850s existed in a state of flux, enough structure to enable commerce, but insufficient oversight to prevent corruption. The perfect environment for those willing to operate outside conventional boundaries. "When did you become Shadow Fox?" Thomas asked, clearly captivated despite his circumstances. "The name came later," Eleanor replied. "My first act of deliberate theft occurred in 1858, 3 years after Charles's murder, Whitford had expanded his operations to include a private lending company that specialized in high-interest loans to desperate miners. His agent was transporting $4,200 in cash collections to Sacramento when I intercepted him at a river crossing. The memory brought a faint smile to her lips. A woman alone on the road with an apparently broken wagon axle. The agent stopped to assist, never suspecting that his charitable impulse would cost his employer nearly everything stolen from my husband's business. This first robbery, small by the standards of her later operations but significant in establishing her course, had been conducted without violence or even direct confrontation. Merely clever planning and an understanding of human psychology, qualities that would become hallmarks of the Shadow Fox methodology. I expected to feel guilt afterward, Eleanor admitted. Instead, I experienced only a profound sense of equilibrium restored. Not complete justice, nothing could return Charles to me, but a balancing of scales that the legal system had failed. To provide, Thomas absorbed this revelation with thoughtful consideration. How did you go from that to leading the most successful gang in Western history? Necessity and opportunity in equal measure, Eleanor explained. That first theft provided resources but also created complications. Once identified as the culprit, which occurred more quickly than I had anticipated, I could no longer move freely through established communities. I retreated to the margins, connected with others similarly displaced by corrupt systems or personal tragedies. She gestured toward the window, where pre-dawn light had begun to soften the darkness. The first actual gang formed organically. 5 of us, each with complementary skills and united by common experiences of injustice. Catherine Mills, whom I mentioned earlier, had lost her family's Mississippi riverboat line to machinations, similar to those that destroyed Charles's business. Daniel Reeves had been a surveyor for the Central Pacific until he discovered and reported fraudulent land claims, only to find himself blacklisted throughout the industry. These origin stories, personal grievances against powerful interests rather than generalized criminality, revealed the unusual foundation upon which Eleanor had built her outlaw career. Where most gangs formed around shared appetites for wealth or violence, the original Shadow Fox gang had coalesced around a common perception of systemic failure. We conducted 3 operations that first year, Eleanor continued, small by later standards, but carefully planned and executed without casualties. Each target was selected based on connections to the same network of financial manipulation that had protected Whitford. We weren't random predators, we were calculated responders to specific predation. The distinction she drew between indiscriminate criminality and targeted retribution highlighted the moral framework that had guided her outlaw career. In Eleanor's narrative, the Shadow Fox gang had been something closer to vigilantes than typical bandits, acting where legal systems had failed rather than simply seeking personal enrichment. The name Shadow Fox first appeared in a Sacramento newspaper in 1859, she recalled. A reference to how we seem to appear and disappear like shadows, coupled with what the reporter called fox-like cunning in our methods. We adopted it deliberately thereafter, using it in messages left at robbery sites to connect our actions in public perception. This strategic cultivation of reputation, creating a recognizable brand for their activities, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how public narrative could serve practical purposes. By establishing the Shadow Fox identity, Eleanor had differentiated her operations from common banditry, creating a distinctive profile that actually assisted in controlling how they were perceived and pursued. By 1861, we had expanded to 12 members and developed the methodologies that later became our signature. Extensive reconnaissance, strategic use of both male and female operatives, non-violent approaches whenever possible, and elaborate Escape protocols that involved multiple diverging routes. She glanced toward the window again, noting the strengthening light. Dawn approaches, and with it, decisions that cannot be postponed. Your brothers will awaken soon, and we must all determine what futures emerge from this unexpected collision of past and present. Thomas studied her with newfound understanding. The romanticized notion of Shadow Fox Hudson that had colored Dime. Novel accounts had been replaced by something more complex, a woman driven by personal tragedy into calculated criminality, guided by principles that, while outside the law, maintained their own coherent morality. "What happened to Whitford?" he asked suddenly. "The man who started all this, did you ever find him?" Eleanor's expression hardened momentarily, then resolved into something more ambiguous. James Whitford died in 1863. His office in San Francisco burned one night with him inside it. The coroner found evidence suggesting he'd been drinking heavily, likely fell asleep with a lit cigar. A tragic accident that closed many outstanding questions. The careful neutrality of her description left the actual circumstances deliberately ambiguous. Whether Shadow Fox Hudson had eventually claimed direct vengeance against the man who destroyed her previous life or merely witnessed karma's resolution remained unspoken. "You should rest while you can," Eleanor advised, rising from her chair with the careful movements of age. "The coming hours will require clear minds and careful choices from all of us." As she moved toward the door, Thomas called softly after her. "Why tell me all this? Why share your story with someone who came to rob you?" Eleanor paused, considering the question with genuine reflection. "Perhaps because in you I see echoes of choices not yet fully made," she replied finally. "The path that led me to become Shadow Fox began with righteous anger, but eventually led places I hadn't anticipated. You stand at similar crossroads, following your brothers into a life that may not reflect your true nature." With that cryptic observation, she left him to his thoughts as the first golden light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky above Clearwater Valley. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed-clean world where decisions made in the coming hours would determine the fate of both the legendary Shadow Fox and the young outlaw whose path had unexpectedly intersected with hers. Dawn broke over Clearwater Valley with the pristine clarity that often follows violent storms. The sun's early rays illuminated a landscape transformed, branches scattered across rain-soaked ground, new rivulets carved into the property's eastern slope, and puddles reflecting the brightening sky like scattered mirrors. Inside, Eleanor Wade's kitchen, the three Blackwood brothers sat in varying states of consciousness. Victor and Lyle had awakened within minutes of each other, both experiencing the disorienting after-effects of the sedative. Thomas, having been awake longer, appeared, more alert, though the night's revelations seemed to have left him thoughtful and subdued. Eleanor stood at the cast-iron stove, preparing coffee with the practiced movements of long habit. Sarah had gone to check on the other Blackwood brothers confined in the barn, carrying a tray with bread, dried beef, and water. Practical hospitality even toward those who had come as enemies. "I trust you gentlemen slept well," Eleanor remarked, the dry humor reflecting something of the legendary Shadow Fox's reputed wit. Now, in full daylight, with no need to maintain her elderly widow facade, her movements had taken on a different quality, still showing the inevitable limitations of age, but without the deliberate fragility she had projected upon the brothers' arrival. Victor Blackwood, his mind clearing with each passing minute, studied her with narrowed eyes. Remarkable. Hospitality, considering the circumstances. Decent treatment of prisoners was another principle that distinguished the Shadow Fox gang from common road agents, Eleanor replied, pouring the coffee into sturdy mugs. "At least, according to those dime novels, your brother Thomas seems familiar." "With," Thomas flushed slightly at this reference to their earlier conversation, avoiding his eldest brother's questioning glance. The dynamics between the brothers had shifted subtly but significantly since their capture. Victor's authority diminished by his strategic error, Lyle's sophistication rendered meaningless in their bound state, and Thomas suddenly positioned as someone with potentially valuable insight into their captor. "My brother appears to have had quite the conversation while we were indisposed," Victor observed, his tone carrying a subtle edge of disapproval. Eleanor placed mugs of coffee before each brother, manipulating their bonds enough to allow them limited movement for drinking. Thomas asked questions others never bothered to consider. She replied evenly, about how circumstances shape our choices rather than merely what results from them. This philosophical framing, focusing on the paths that led to current circumstances, rather than merely present conditions, reflected the underlying complexity that had always separated Eleanor Hudson from typical outlaws. Where most lived entirely in the immediate moment, she had maintained awareness of both historical context and future implications. "And now?" Lyle asked, speaking for the first time since awakening. "What choices present themselves this morning?" Eleanor took a seat opposite them, her own coffee cradled between hands that showed decades of practical work, despite their current cleanliness. "That depends largely on what we learn from our remaining guests." As if summoned by her words, the kitchen. Dahar opened to admit Sarah, her expression carefully neutral as she entered. "They're awake," she reported. "Mason's shoulder wound is clean, just a graze as I thought. Franklin seems to have suffered a mild concussion from the fall, but his pupils are even, and he's coherent." Eleanor nodded, absorbing this practical assessment. "Their dispositions." "Franklin alternates between threats and sullen silence," Sarah replied with professional detachment. "Mason asks intelligent questions about the mechanisms that captured them. He seems more curious than angry." This report, delivered with the precision of a military update, further illuminated the relationship between the two women. Sarah wasn't merely a protégé or assistant, but a full partner in Eleanor's security operations, trusted with independent evaluations and decisions. "Interesting," Eleanor mused. "Victor, would you say that assessment aligns with your brother's typical responses to setbacks?" Victor hesitated, clearly weighing the strategic value of cooperation against the principle of loyalty. Finally, practicality prevailed. "Accurate enough. Franklin processes most situations through anger. Mason analyzes problems, looking for solutions rather than culprits." "Bring them in," Eleanor instructed Sarah. "We should have this conversation with all parties present." As Sarah departed to retrieve the remaining Blackwood brothers, tension in the kitchen increased perceptibly. Whatever resolution Eleanor had contemplated during the night would soon be implemented, determining the fate of 5 men who had come seeking legendary gold, and instead found the legend herself. Victor straightened as much as his bonds would, allow reassuming the mantle of leadership despite their compromised position. "Before your other guests arrive, perhaps we might discuss terms more directly." Eleanor regarded him with the measured assessment that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in Western history. "Terms suggest negotiation between parties with relatively equal leverage. Our current circumstances seem somewhat imbalanced in that regard." "Circumstances can change rapidly," Victor countered smoothly. "The Blackwood name carries certain associations. Our absence will be noted, investigations initiated. Sheriff Bannerman may be absent now, but his return brings complications for everyone in this valley." The implicit threat that pursuit would eventually follow, regardless of Eleanor's immediate decisions, reflected Victor's strategic mind. Even bound and at apparent disadvantage, he sought leverage through longer-term considerations. "A valid observation," Eleanor acknowledged, unruffled by the underlying warning. Though you overestimate local concern for missing outlaws and underestimate my preparations for exactly such eventualities. Before Victor could respond, the kitchen door opened again. Sarah entered first, revolver held casually but ready, followed by Franklin and Mason Blackwood. Both men had their hands bound before them, though they were permitted to walk unassisted. Franklin's massive frame seemed diminished somewhat by a significant bruise, discoloring his left temple, while Mason's right shoulder bore bandaging visible beneath his torn shirt. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Franklin growled, his voice matching his bear-like appearance. "Family reunion with our gracious hostess?" Mason, by contrast, surveyed the room with the analytical gaze of someone gathering information rather than preparing hostilities. His eyes lingered briefly on each detail, the positions of furniture, the quality of ropes binding his brothers, and most significantly, the composed elder woman who had orchestrated their capture. Franklin, Mason, Eleanor greeted them with simple dignity. "Please join your brothers. Sarah will adjust your bindings for reasonable comfort while we talk." The casual authority in her voice, the natural command presence that had once led a dozen hardened outlaws through the most dangerous operations in Western history, seemed to register with both men. Even Franklin, despite his belligerent words, complied without physical resistance, as Sarah secured them to kitchen chairs, positioned near their brothers. "Now then," Eleanor began once all 5 Blackwood brothers were assembled, "we find ourselves at an interesting juncture. You came seeking gold from a legend. Instead, you found the legend herself, very much alive and disinclined to surrender what she spent decades protecting." She sipped her coffee, the mundane action incongruous with the extraordinary circumstances. "The question before us is what resolution best serves everyone's interests going forward." Franklin snorted derisively. "Lady, you may have gotten the drop on us with your bag of widow tricks, but there's no resolution where 5 grown men just tip their hats and forget about 30,000 in gold." "Shut up, Frank," Victor commanded sharply. "Your helpful contributions are why we're sitting here trussed like Thanksgiving turkeys." Eleanor watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone evaluating group dynamics. The friction between the brothers, tactical Victor versus impulsive Franklin, revealed potential pressure points that might influence the situation's outcome. "Victor suggests that your absence will trigger investigation," she observed, returning to their earlier discussion. "An accurate assessment in more settled regions, perhaps, but Montana Territory in 1899 still operates with significant gaps in formal authority. Men disappear regularly into mines, mountains, or unmarked graves. Few questions follow unless powerful interests demand answers. This cold assessment of frontier reality, the ease with which men could vanish without consequence, served as a subtle reminder of the options available to her, including permanent solutions to the Blackwood problem. Yet such measures create complications of their own, she continued as if reading their thoughts. Bodies may eventually be discovered, questions arise belatedly, patterns emerge that draw unwanted attention. Mason spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to careful observation. "You've maintained this identity for 30 years through meticulous attention to detail, disposing of 5 men, even in remote and territory, introduces variables difficult to control completely." Eleanor inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of his assessment. "A concise summary of one aspect of our situation." Lyle Blackwood, the most refined of the brothers, leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps we might discuss alternatives beneficial to all parties, professional courtesy between colleagues in related fields." This attempt to establish common ground, framing both Eleanor and the Blackwoods as practitioners of similar trades, reflected Lyle's diplomatic approach, seeking connection rather than confrontation despite their circumstances. You misunderstand our relationship, Eleanor corrected him gently. We are not colleagues, Mr. Blackwood. The distinctions between the Shadow Fox gang's operations and your activities extend beyond mere technical differences in methodology. Robbery is robbery, Franklin interjected bluntly. Dress it up however you want with fancy plans and lady accomplices, but you took what wasn't yours, same as us. Eleanor's expression remained unruffled by this crude equivalence. Perspective determines much about how we interpret both history and morality, Mr. Blackwood. From certain vantage points, similarities might appear to outweigh differences. From others, the distinctions become essential rather than incidental. This philosophical response, elevating their discussion beyond immediate circumstances to broader questions of interpretation, demonstrated the intellectual depth that had separated Eleanor Hudson from typical outlaws of her era. Where most lived entirely within the concrete realities of their profession, she had maintained awareness of its place within larger social contexts. Your situation now requires similar perspective, she continued. 5 paths diverge from this. Kitchen today. Which you follow depends on decisions made in the next hour. Thomas, who had remained silent throughout these exchanges, spoke up unexpectedly. What are the 5 paths? Eleanor turned her attention to the youngest brother, her expression softening slightly as it had during their pre-dawn conversation. 5 brothers, 5 potential futures, not necessarily identical. This cryptic response, suggesting she contemplated different outcomes for different brothers rather than treating them as a single unit, introduced a new dimension to their predicament. The solidarity that had previously united the Blackwoods against a common captor suddenly faced the possibility of individualized treatment based on Eleanor's assessment of each man. Victor's expression darkened at this implication. We ride together. Whatever arrangement is reached applies to all of us. Admirable loyalty, Eleanor acknowledged, though perhaps premature given the circumstances. Not all crimes carry equal weight, nor do all participants bear identical responsibility. She rose from the table with the careful movements of age and moved to the window, gazing out at the sunlit valley below her property. The strategic position of her homestead became even more apparent in daylight, situated on a gentle rise that provided clear sightlines in all directions, with no approach that couldn't be observed well in advance of arrival. Sheriff Bannerman returns in 2 days, she observed, her back still turned to the brothers. A good man by frontier standards, enforces the law as written rather than as purchased by powerful interests. He would certainly be interested in capturing the Blackwood gang, responsible for the Silver Creek stage robbery last autumn that left 2 passengers wounded. This specific reference, accurately connecting the brothers to a particular crime, demonstrated that Eleanor's knowledge of their activities extended beyond what might be expected from isolated rumors. Like the Shadow Fox of legend, Eleanor Wade had maintained awareness of criminal operations throughout the region, gathering intelligence through channels invisible to casual observation. Turning us over means exposing yourself, Lyle pointed out. Difficult to explain how an elderly widow and her niece captured 5 experienced outlaws without revealing capabilities that raise their own questions. Eleanor turned back from the window, her expression unreadable. A valid consideration, though perhaps not as definitive as you imagine. Alternative narratives exist that might satisfy official curiosity without necessitating complete disclosure. Sarah, who had maintained her vigilant position near the door throughout these exchanges, spoke up unexpectedly. The hunting party from the Carson Ranch, expected through the valley today or tomorrow, according to Mrs. Larson at the general store. This seemingly innocuous information, a local hunting group's movements, clearly carried strategic significance between the 2 women. Eleanor nodded slightly, absorbing this detail into her calculations. "Circumstances evolve," she commented. "Options expand or contract accordingly." Victor studied both women with increasing wariness, recognizing that layers of planning and contingency surrounded them, preparations far more extensive than might be expected from a simple homesteader concerned with basic security. "What do you want?" he asked finally, cutting through philosophical abstraction to practical resolution. "Every negotiation has core interests beneath stated positions. What outcome would satisfy yours?" The directness of the question, focusing on Eleanor's fundamental objectives rather than tactical maneuvers, reflected Victor's strategic mind. Despite their adversarial positions, he sought to understand her underlying motivations as a pathway to potential agreement. Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully, weighing how much to reveal of her true considerations. "My primary interest is continuation of the life I've built here, peaceful, productive, and private. Secondary considerations include appropriate dispensation of justice and maintenance of certain principles that have guided my decisions for decades. Justice is negotiable depending on perspective," Victor observed carefully, "as are principles when circumstances demand flexibility." A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips, acknowledging the sophisticated attempt to establish common ground through moral relativism. "Some principles bend more readily than others, Mr. Blackwood. Mine have held their shape through circumstances far more challenging than our current situation." Franklin, clearly frustrated by the abstract nature of the conversation, strained against his bonds. "Enough fancy talk. Either shoot us, turn us in, or name your price. Sitting here trading words solves nothing." "On the contrary," Eleanor countered calmly, "words frequently resolve situations that bullets merely conclude. The distinction is subtle but significant." Before Franklin could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside. Hoofbeats, approaching at a steady pace up the main trail to the property. Not the rapid approach of threat or emergency, but the deliberate progress of expected visitors. Sarah moved immediately to the window, positioning herself to observe without being easily seen from outside. "Two riders," she reported after a moment, "coming up the main trail. Carson's foreman, Jenkins, and one of his hands by the look of it." This development, unexpected visitors arriving in the midst of their delicate negotiation, introduced a new complexity to the already tense situation. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing as she absorbed this information, but the subtle straightening of her posture suggested increased alertness. "Well now," she said softly, "it seems our timeline has compressed somewhat. Decisions that might have evolved through careful discussion now require more immediate resolution." Victor exchanged glances with his brothers, clearly recognizing both the complication and potential opportunity presented by outside intervention. "Visitors change considerations for everyone," he observed neutrally. "Indeed," Eleanor agreed, her mind working through implications and options with the strategic clarity that had once made her legendary. "Sarah, prepare our guests for company. I believe the root cellar offers both security and discretion for the moment." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the Blackwood brothers with additional lengths of rope. "Stand slowly, one at a time," she instructed, beginning with Franklin. "Any sudden movements will be met with immediate consequences." As Sarah efficiently prepared the brothers for temporary relocation, Eleanor moved toward the front window, positioning herself to observe the approaching riders, while remaining partially concealed by the curtain. Her expression remained composed, but the increased intensity in her eyes revealed the tactical calculations taking place behind her calm exterior. The unexpected arrival, introducing external factors into their carefully balanced confrontation, would force both Eleanor and the Blackwood brothers to adapt quickly. Whatever resolution Eleanor had contemplated would now unfold under additional pressure, accelerating decisions that might otherwise have developed more gradually. Outside, the two riders had reached the front gate, their arrival introducing new variables into an equation already balanced on a knife's edge. The next few minutes would determine whether Eleanor Wade's carefully constructed life would continue or collapse under the weight of its long hidden foundations, and whether the Blackwood brothers would find opportunity or deeper entanglement. In this unexpected development, the Blackwood brothers disappeared into Eleanor's root cellar in a hurried but orderly procession, shepherded by Sarah's unwavering revolver and firm instructions. The cellar, accessible through a concealed door in the kitchen pantry, was no simple storage space, but a carefully constructed underground room with reinforced walls, ample air circulation, and, most importantly, no interior mechanism to open the door once closed. As the last brother descended and Sarah secured the heavy door, Eleanor was already transforming back into the role she had played for decades. Her posture subtly shifted, shoulders curving forward slightly, hands adopting a faint tremor, face arranging itself into the pleasant but slightly vague expression expected of an elderly widow. The legendary Shadow Fox vanished beneath the careful construction of Eleanor Wade's public persona with practiced ease. 2 minutes until they reach the house, Sarah reported, quickly checking the kitchen for any evidence of their recent confrontation. Jenkins and Billy Tate from the Carson Ranch, definitely. Eleanor nodded, already moving toward the front door with the careful gait of age. Likely checking on us after the storm. Maggie Carson always sends someone to verify we weathered things safely when the creek threatens flooding. This simple explanation, neighbors checking on an elderly widow after severe weather, provided perfect cover for the unexpected visit. Eleanor had carefully cultivated such relationships throughout Clearwater Valley, establishing herself as a respected, if somewhat reclusive figure worthy of community concern. "What if they need to use the outhouse?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding toward the concealed root cellar door. 5 men make noise, no matter how careful. Eleanor's smile held grim humor. The Blackwoods are experienced enough to recognize their circumstances. Even Franklin understands that drawing attention now serves no one's interests, least of all theirs. The approaching riders reached the front yard, just as Eleanor positioned herself on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders, despite the morning warmth, another small detail reinforcing the image of elderly fragility. Sarah remained inside, visible through the open door, but occupied with seemingly mundane household tasks, her loaded revolver now hidden beneath a dish towel on the kitchen table. "Morning, Mrs. Wade," called Jenkins, a weathered man in his 50s, who managed daily operations at the Carson Cattle Ranch. "Thought we'd check how you ladies fared in last night's blow. Creek's running high, but didn't jump its banks down our way." Eleanor smiled warmly, the picture of grateful spinsterhood. "How thoughtful of Maggie to send you, Mr. Jenkins." "We're quite well, thank you. Lost a few roof shingles by the sound of it, but nothing Sarah's young bones can't handle with a ladder later today." Jenkins dismounted with the fluid ease of a lifelong horseman, while Billy Tate, a ranch hand barely out of his teens, remained in the saddle, his eyes scanning the property with unconscious vigilance. Neither man showed any indication they suspected. "Anything unusual about the homestead or its occupants?" "Got a message from Sheriff Bannerman, too," Jenkins added, approaching the porch steps. "Telegraph came to the ranch yesterday before the storm hit. He's delayed in Helena another 4 days. Asked if we'd pass word to folks around the valley in case anyone needed him urgent." This information, the extended absence of local law enforcement, registered in Eleanor's mind as a significant tactical detail, even as she maintained her genial expression. "I do hope nothing serious is keeping him. Helena's such a dreadful place for an honest man like our sheriff." Jenkins nodded agreement. Trial complications, from what the telegram said. Some business with witnesses not arriving on schedule. He glanced around the property, professional awareness noting details despite his casual manner. Didn't see any stock damage on our ride up. Your barn looks to have weathered things well. The Lord provides, Eleanor replied with the mild piety expected of her public persona. Would you gentlemen care for coffee? Sarah just put a fresh pot on before you arrived. Jenkins removed his hat, running calloused fingers through grey, streaked hair. Much obliged, Mrs. Wade, but we've got 3 more homesteads to check before noon. Carson wants a full accounting of any storm damage that might affect grazing access before the cattle drive next week. Eleanor nodded understanding, careful to mask her relief at their imminent departure. Of course. Please give my best to Maggie and tell her we'll be at Sunday services with that huckleberry preserve I promised, storm or no storm. As the brief conversation concluded and the riders prepared to depart, Billy Tate suddenly straightened in his saddle, attention focused on something near the barn. "Mr. Jenkins," he called, voice low but carrying clearly in the morning air. "Those fresh tracks by the barn gate, more than 2 horses passed through there recently." Jenkins paused, turning to follow the young ranch hand's gaze. His expression sharpened as professional assessment replaced neighborly concern. Multiple sets of hoofprints were indeed visible in the mud near the barn, clearly made after the rain had stopped, but before the ground had begun to dry. "Expecting other visitors, Mrs. Wade?" he asked, tone still respectful but carrying a new edge of caution. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing beyond mild confusion, appropriate to her elderly persona. "No visitors that I recall, though Sarah mentioned seeing deer in the kitchen garden early this morning. Perhaps they wandered through the yard." Jenkins frowned slightly, moving toward the tracks with practiced ease. "These are shod horses, ma'am. At least 4, maybe 5 different animals." He crouched, examining the impressions more carefully. "Heavy, too, carrying riders, not just walking empty." The situation balanced on a knife's edge as Jenkins continued his inspection. Eleanor maintained her benign expression, but beneath her, shawl. Her hand had moved to the small pocket sewn into her dress where a derringer rested, a final precaution she had carried daily for 30 years. "Well, that is peculiar," she acknowledged, adding a touch of elderly confusion to her voice. "Sarah, dear, did anyone call while I was resting yesterday?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, the very picture of innocent youth. "No, Aunt Eleanor. Just since Mr. Callahan delivered supplies 3 days ago." Jenkins straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. His expression had turned serious, the neighborly visit now transformed by potential security concerns. "Mrs. Wade, I don't want to alarm you, but there have been reports of the Blackwood gang operating in territories east of here. 5 brothers who've been robbing stagecoaches and isolated homesteads. These tracks are fresh, not more than a few hours old." Eleanor allowed appropriate alarm to register on her features. "Goodness, you don't think—" "Probably nothing," Jenkins interrupted, reassuringly, though his hand had moved significantly closer to his holstered revolver. "But I'd feel better having a look around your property before we leave, just to be certain." This development, unexpected inspection by capable men, threatened to unravel the delicate containment of the Blackwood brothers. Eleanor's mind raced through contingencies even as she maintained her flustered exterior. "Of course, Mr. Jenkins, whatever you think best, though I can't imagine Outlaws having any interest in 2 women with barely enough saved for winter supplies." As Jenkins signaled Billy to dismount and begin checking the periphery of the property, a horse and rider appeared on the trail leading up from the valley floor. The newcomer approached at an unhurried pace that suggested routine rather than urgency. "That's Nathaniel Cooper," Sarah observed, providing the identification before either ranch hand could question the arrival. Jenkins relaxed visibly at the name. "Cooper's a good man. Served with him under General Crook back in '76. If there's—" Trouble. Another capable gun won't hurt. Eleanor's expression betrayed nothing, but inwardly she assessed this new complication. Nathaniel Cooper was indeed a familiar figure in Clearwater Valley, a blacksmith who had established his shop in the small settlement 8 miles east of Eleanor's homestead 4 years earlier. A quiet man in his mid-60s, with a military bearing he'd never quite abandoned, Cooper kept largely to himself, but had earned respect for both his craftsmanship and his straightforward dealing. What Jenkins couldn't know, what no one in the valley suspected, was that Nathaniel Cooper had once been Nathan Collier, second in command of the Shadow Fox gang and Eleanor Hudson's most trusted lieutenant. Cooper reached the front yard and dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body carried memories of old injuries. Tall and lean, with a full white beard and hands permanently darkened by forge work, he nodded greeting to Jenkins and Tate before touching the brim of his hat respectfully toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Wade," he said, his deep voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had inhaled too much coal smoke over decades at the forge. "Thought I'd check your property after that blow. Creek's running high enough to take out fence sections if it rose through the night." The explanation for his visit mirrored Jenkins' own, providing perfect cover for his appearance. Whether Cooper had actually come to check on storm damage or had some other purpose remained unclear, though the timing suggested more than coincidence. "Very thoughtful, Mr. Cooper," Eleanor replied warmly. "We were just discussing some peculiar tracks Mr. Jenkins discovered near the barn. Perhaps you might offer your assessment as well." Cooper's expression revealed nothing beyond mild interest as he turned toward Jenkins. "Tracks, you say?" Jenkins gestured toward the barn. "Multiple horses, fresh since the rain. Given reports of the Blackwood gang in neighboring counties, thought it warranted investigation." Cooper nodded thoughtfully, moving toward the indicated area with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to methodical work. He crouched beside the hoofprints, studying them with focused attention while the others watched. 5 distinct sets, he confirmed after a moment. Came in from the eastern trail, not the main approach. He pointed towards subtle differences in the impressions that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. 1 horse carrying extra weight, 2 riders or heavy packs, another favoring its left front hoof, slight irregularity in the shoe. This detailed analysis, far beyond casual observation, reflected Cooper's background as a tracker during his military service, skills that had served the Shadow Fox gang equally well during their operations. His assessment provided confirmation of Jenkins' concerns while simultaneously establishing his value to the current situation. "Reckon we should check the barn and outbuildings," Jenkins suggested, hand now resting openly on his holstered weapon. "Mrs. Wade, perhaps you and the girl should wait inside while we have a look around." Eleanor nodded with appropriate concern. "Of course. Please be careful, gentlemen." As she and Sarah retreated inside, Cooper exchanged a brief glance with Eleanor, a silent communication invisible to the ranch hands but loaded with shared history and unspoken strategy. Whatever happened next would involve coordinated action based on decades of mutual trust. Inside the house, Eleanor moved toward the kitchen, with purpose rather than her previously affected careful gait. "He came because of them," she stated quietly once they were beyond earshot of the men outside. "Must have seen them riding toward our property yesterday before the storm hit." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Cooper always watches the approaches to the valley, but how will he explain away the missing horses if Jenkins checks the barn thoroughly? The Blackwood's mounts are still in the corral out back." This practical concern, material evidence that couldn't be easily concealed, highlighted the immediate threat to their careful containment of the situation. 5 additional horses on the property would raise questions no simple explanation could satisfy. "Nathan will handle it," Eleanor replied with confidence born of long association. "He didn't survive 30 years by failing to manage unexpected complications. The use of Cooper's original name, Nathan rather than Nathaniel, marked a subtle shift in Eleanor's thinking, reconnecting to their shared past rather than their carefully constructed present identities. Whatever happened next would draw on old skills rather than new pretenses. Outside, Cooper led Jenkins and Billy Tate on a methodical inspection of the property perimeter, deliberately steering them away from the rear corral where the Blackwoods horses had been secured. His measured comments about potential storm damage and security vulnerabilities established him as knowledgeable and thorough, while simultaneously controlling which areas received closest scrutiny. Eleanor watched through the kitchen window, noting with approval how Cooper positioned himself throughout the inspection, always between the ranch hands and the most compromising evidence, directing attention through seemingly casual observations and questions. "He hasn't lost his touch," she observed quietly, "still manages men's perceptions like pieces on a chessboard." Sarah studied the unfolding dynamics with equal attention. "Will you tell him about your decision, about what you're considering for the Blackwoods?" Eleanor's expression turned thoughtful. "Nathan and I have rarely kept secrets from each other, even during our decades of separation. His perspective has value, particularly regarding long-term implications." This acknowledgement that Cooper's opinion would factor into her ultimate resolution of the Blackwood situation revealed the unusual depth of their connection. Despite years living separate lives under constructed identities, the trust between former outlaw leader and lieutenant remained undiminished. "He was more than your second in command, wasn't he?" Sarah asked suddenly, intuiting something beyond professional respect in Eleanor's demeanor when discussing Cooper. Eleanor's smile carried complex emotions, fondness, regret, and something more personal than her usual composed restraint. Life, in our profession, created bonds different from conventional relationships. Nathan and I shared dangers and decisions that few could understand. That creates connections that neither time nor distance fully severs. This rare personal disclosure, hinting at deeper dimensions to their historical partnership, added another layer to the already complex narrative of Eleanor Hudson's extraordinary life. Shadow Fox hadn't merely been an exceptional tactical leader. She had formed profound human connections within the dangerous world she navigated. The inspection outside concluded with Cooper leading the ranch hands back toward the front yard, their postures suggesting no immediate threats had been identified. Eleanor straightened her shawl and resumed her elderly widow persona before stepping onto the porch to receive their report. "Perimeter seems secure, Mrs. Wade," Jenkins announced, though his expression remained somewhat troubled. "No sign of unauthorized entry to any buildings. Still, those tracks concern me." Cooper cleaned his hands with a handkerchief, his movements unhurried and practical. "Tracks angle away toward the North Ridge after passing the barn," he observed. "Likely riders using your property as a cut-through to avoid the flooded section of valley floor, common enough during spring rains when the main trail floods." This explanation, simple, logical, and difficult to disprove without extensive tracking, offered the ranch hands a reasonable alternative to more sinister interpretations. Cooper had provided not just physical intervention, but a narrative that addressed the concerning evidence while discouraging further investigation. Still, Jenkins insisted, with the Blackwood gang reported in neighboring counties, unusual visitors warrant caution. Perhaps I should send Billy back to the ranch for a few more men. We could maintain a watch overnight just to be certain. This suggestion, extended surveillance of Eleanor's property, would completely undermine their containment of the actual Blackwoods currently secured in the root cellar. Eleanor concealed her concern behind an expression of grateful consideration. While her mind rapidly assessed countermeasures, Cooper saved her the trouble. "No need to divert men from Carson's operation," he stated with quiet authority. "I was planning to repair Mrs. Wade's forge set up today anyway. Happy to stay overnight, keep watch while I'm here. Military habits die hard. Light sleeper with a loaded sharps rifle tends to discourage unwanted visitors. The offer, perfectly aligned with both his public identity as helpful blacksmith and the actual security needs of the situation, demonstrated Cooper's strategic thinking. By volunteering to remain on the property, he simultaneously reassured Jenkins while positioning himself to assist with the real crisis hidden beneath their neighborly interactions. Jenkins considered the proposal, visibly weighing concerns against Cooper's proven competence. That would ease my mind considerably, Nathaniel. Mrs. Carson would have my hide if anything happened to these ladies with the sheriff away. Decision made, the ranch hands prepared to depart, promising to check back the following day and to spread word about possible strangers in the area. As they mounted and rode toward the valley floor, Eleanor maintained her grateful expression until they disappeared around the bend in the trail. Only then did she turn to Cooper, all pretense of fragility vanishing as she addressed her former lieutenant directly for the first time. Perfect timing as always, Nathan, though I suspect it wasn't the storm that brought you to my door this morning. Cooper's weathered face revealed little, but a hint of the old connection flickered in his eyes as he responded. Saw 5 riders heading toward your property yesterday afternoon, Blackwood brothers, unless I miss my guess. Figured you might appreciate an extra gun when they made their move. Eleanor gestured toward the house. They made their move. It didn't proceed as they anticipated. Something like grim amusement touched Cooper's expression. Never did understand how men keep underestimating you, even after all these years. A useful blind spot in male perception, Eleanor replied with equal understatement. One we exploited often enough in our previous occupation. This oblique reference to their shared past, the years riding together as the 2 principal leaders of the Shadow Fox gang, acknowledged the history that bound them while maintaining the cautious habits of people who had survived by careful speech and vigilant awareness. We have much to discuss, Eleanor continued, moving toward the house. The situation has evolved beyond simple trespassers. Decisions with significant implications lie ahead. Cooper followed, his expression revealing the focus that had once made him Shadow Fox's most valued strategist. Some coffee might help that discussion, assuming our guests can wait a while longer for resolution of their circumstances. Eleanor smiled faintly as they entered the house together, former outlaw leader and lieutenant, reunited by circumstances neither could have anticipated when they'd parted ways after Laramie Crossing 30 years earlier. The Blackwoods have nowhere. Urgent to be, she assured him. And with the sheriff delayed another 4 days, we have ample time to determine exactly what future awaits them and us once this unexpected collision of past and present reaches its conclusion. The root cellar beneath Eleanor Wade's kitchen was no ordinary storage space. Like every aspect of her property, it had been designed with specific contingencies in mind. 10 feet by 12, with a ceiling just high enough for a tall man to stand. Upright, the space featured sturdy shelving along 3 walls, stocked with preserved foods, medical supplies, and other essentials. More importantly for its current occupants, it included a small air shaft disguised as a drainage pipe outside, providing both ventilation and a subtle source of light. The 5 Blackwood brothers sat in various positions around the earthen floor, their bonds allowing limited movement but preventing any effective attempt at escape. In the dimness, their expressions reflected varying responses to their predicament. Victor's calculating assessment, Lyle's controlled frustration, Franklin's simmering anger, Mason's analytical observation, and Thomas's thoughtful introspection. Somebody's up there with them, Mason reported quietly, his ear pressed against the ceiling. With his tracker's trained senses, he could distinguish footsteps and movement patterns even through the floorboards. New arrival. Male. Based on the tread weight, not moving like someone under threat. Victor nodded slightly, unsurprised by this development. The widow's network extends beyond the girl, clearly. She's had 30 years to establish connections that remain invisible to casual observation. This assessment, acknowledging Eleanor's extensive preparation rather than dismissing their capture as mere luck, revealed Victor's strategic mind. Unlike many men who might attribute defeat to bad fortune rather than superior planning, he recognized the careful orchestration behind their current circumstances. We need to consider the possibility that this isn't an isolated situation, he continued, voice low, but carrying clearly to all his brothers. If Wade or Hudson maintains relationships with former associates, our options narrow considerably. Associates like who? Franklin demanded, his frustration evident in his clenched jaw and restless movements against his bonds. Her gang's been dead or scattered for 30 years. She's an old woman with one girl for backup. Victor's expression hardened slightly at this dismissive assessment. That old woman has outmaneuvered 5 experienced outlaws, secured us in a hidden room beneath her kitchen, and apparently coordinated with at least one outside ally without raising suspicions among her neighbors. Age hasn't diminished her capabilities, merely changed their application. This grudging respect for their captor, acknowledging Eleanor's effectiveness despite their adversarial positions, distinguished Victor from more common criminals whose egos would prevent such objective assessment. His ability to recognize and adapt to changing circumstances had kept the Blackwood gang operational, while other outlaw groups had been captured or killed. Lyle shifted position, finding minimal comfort against the root cellar wall. So we're agreed that our circumstances are more complex than initially evident. The question remains, what leverage do we possess, if any? This practical focus on negotiating options rather than lamenting their situation reflected the diplomatic role Lyle typically played within the Blackwood operation. While Franklin provided muscle and Victor strategic direction, Lyle's contribution had always been identifying advantages in seemingly disadvantageous positions. "She hasn't killed us," Thomas observed suddenly. The youngest brother had been unusually quiet since their confinement, his expression suggesting internal deliberation rather than simple resignation. "She could have easily when we were unconscious. Instead, we're secured but unharmed." Mason nodded agreement. "Valid observation. Hudson wants something other than our elimination, despite the threat we represent to her carefully constructed identity. Or she's just squeamish about killing unconscious men," Franklin countered. "Women often lack the stomach for necessary violence." Victor's laugh held no humor. The Shadow Fox gang killed 23 men during their operating years, according to newspaper accounts. While the numbers were likely exaggerated for dramatic effect, Hudson clearly demonstrated willingness to employ lethal force when situations required it. This historical context, acknowledging Eleanor's documented capacity for violence despite her current restrained approach, highlighted the deliberate choice behind their continued survival. They weren't alive due to weakness on her part, but because death didn't serve her immediate purposes. "She's considering options," Victor continued, "just as we must. The arrival of another party upstairs suggests she's consulting trusted counsel before finalizing her approach." Mason, still listening intently to movements above, reported additional observations. "They've moved to what sounds like the front room. Conversation continues, but too muffled to distinguish words. No tension in movement patterns. Whoever arrived is definitely an ally, not a threat." As the brothers processed this information, Thomas cleared his throat hesitantly. "There's something else we should consider, something she revealed during our conversation before dawn." All eyes turned to the youngest Blackwood, whose unusual interaction with Eleanor while his brothers were unconscious had clearly yielded information beyond what they'd collectively gathered. Victor nodded encouragement, recognizing the potential value in Thomas's insights. "She told me about her origins," Thomas began carefully. "Not just generalities, but specific details about her life before becoming Shadow Fox. She was Eleanor Sullivan originally from Boston. Educated family, married a banker named Charles Hudson, who was murdered after losing everything in a banking scandal. Her entire criminal career began as targeted retribution against corruption, not random predation. This detailed background, humanizing the legendary outlaw through personal tragedy and principled motivation, added significant dimension to their understanding of their captor. Eleanor Hudson hadn't emerged fully formed as Shadow Fox, but had evolved through specific experiences and choices that shaped her subsequent actions. Did she explain why she shared this information with you specifically? Victor asked, his tone neutral but gaze intent. Thomas hesitated before responding. She said she saw in me echoes of choices not yet fully made, that I stand at similar crossroads to where she once found herself, following others into a life that might not reflect my true nature. This personal assessment, Eleanor recognizing something in Thomas that distinguished him from his brothers, introduced a potential wedge in the Blackwood solidarity. Victor's expression revealed recognition of this implication, his strategic mind immediately calculating its significance to their collective circumstances. She's identifying vulnerabilities, he observed, neither accusatory nor dismissive, establishing connections that might facilitate her objectives, standard negotiating tactics, though applied with unusual psychological insight. Franklin snorted derisively. She's playing the boy, Victor, feeding him some sob story about justice and principles to make him sympathetic. Thomas needs to remember where his loyalties lie. My loyalties haven't changed, Thomas responded with unexpected firmness. But neither has my ability to think independently. There's value in understanding her perspective, regardless of how we ultimately respond to it. This assertion of intellectual autonomy, the youngest Blackwood refusing to simply adopt his eldest brother's interpretation, suggested evolution in family dynamics accelerated by their current crisis. Thomas, previously the follower among them, was demonstrating capacity for independent assessment their confined situation hadn't anticipated. Mason, ever the practical observer, interrupted this emerging tension. Movement above suggests conclusion of their discussion. Someone's approaching the kitchen area. The brothers fell silent, attention shifting to the ceiling as footsteps became audible even to less sensitive ears than Mason's. Light infiltrated the root cellar as the door opened, revealing Sarah silhouetted against the kitchen brightness. Behind her stood a tall, white-bearded man the Blackwoods hadn't previously encountered. One at a time, Sarah instructed, revolver steady in her hand. Victor first. Any resistance affects everyone's treatment. Victor rose with dignity despite his bonds, moving carefully toward the steep stairs leading up to the kitchen. The white-bearded man, clearly the new arrival Mason had detected, watched with the alert assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. Though appearing to be in his 60s, his posture and movement suggested military training and physical capability that belied his age. As Victor emerged into the kitchen, he found Eleanor seated at the table, a cup of coffee before her, and all pretense of elderly fragility abandoned. She gestured toward a chair opposite her, which Victor took without comment, noting that his bonds were now being secured to the sturdy furniture by the bearded man with practiced efficiency. "Victor Blackwood," Eleanor began once he was secured, "allow me to introduce Nathaniel Cooper. In another life, he was Nathan Collier, second in command of the Shadow Fox gang and my most trusted lieutenant." This direct introduction, naming both Cooper's current identity and his historical connection to Eleanor, established immediate context for their expanded discussion. Eleanor wasn't merely revealing her associate, but deliberately establishing The expanded power dynamic their conversation would entail, Mr. Cooper, Victor acknowledged, with the careful courtesy that had always distinguished his approach even in adversarial situations. Your reputation preceded you, though most accounts suggested you died at Laramie Crossing, alongside your leader. Cooper's weathered face revealed little beyond mild interest as he completed securing Victor's bonds. History records many convenient falsehoods, Mr. Blackwood. The living sometimes find advantage in being numbered among the dead. This philosophical observation, acknowledging the strategic value of presumed death, established common ground between men who understood frontier realities beyond conventional morality. Though adversaries in their current situation, both recognized the practical calculations that shaped survival in their respective eras. Your brothers will join us shortly, Eleanor explained, but I wanted a private moment to ensure we understand each other clearly before wider discussion begins. Specifics matter in delicate negotiations, and you strike me as someone who appreciates precision in both language and expectations. Victor inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the accurate assessment of his character. Precision creates fewer misunderstandings in complex situations. I'm listening. Good, Eleanor replied, taking a measured sip of her coffee. Because circumstances have evolved since our initial conversation. Mr. Cooper's arrival introduces new variables, as does the extended absence of Sheriff Bannerman, now delayed in Helena for at least 4 additional days. This information, particularly the extended absence of local law enforcement, represented significant tactical developments that Victor immediately integrated into his assessment of their situation. The extended time frame created both opportunities and complications for all parties involved. More importantly, Eleanor continued, Mr. Cooper provides historical context I find valuable when making decisions with long-term implications. Having navigated similar transitions decades ago, his perspective on our current circumstances carries particular weight. Cooper remained standing near the kitchen door, his posture reflecting the casual readiness of someone who had spent decades anticipating potential threats. Though his hands held no visible weapon, his presence alone communicated capability honed through experiences few men survived to remember. You're conducting a formal consultation, Victor observed, recognizing the structured approach underlying their conversation. Establishing parameters before committing to specific resolution, a methodical approach I wouldn't have expected from legends portrayed in dime novels as impulsive action heroes. Eleanor's smile held genuine amusement for the first time since their confrontation began. Dime novels sell through dramatic confrontations and lucky escapes, Mr. Blackwood. Reality favors careful planning and risk assessment. The Shadow Fox gang succeeded precisely because we prioritized methodology over mythology. This insight into her operational philosophy, privileging systematic approaches over dramatic gestures, further distinguished Eleanor Hudson from conventional outlaw narratives. Where popular accounts emphasized boldness and intuition, her actual success had derived from strategic thinking and careful execution. Your brother Thomas suggested something similar during our pre-dawn conversation, Eleanor added, watching Victor's reaction carefully. He possesses unusual perceptiveness for someone so young, particularly regarding the distinction between legend and reality. Victor's expression revealed nothing beyond mild interest, though her deliberate mention of Thomas's separate conversation clearly registered. Thomas has always been observant, a family trait, though expressed differently across generations. This subtle defense of his youngest brother, acknowledging Thomas's distinct qualities while reinforcing family connection, demonstrated Victor's leadership approach. Even in captivity, he maintained awareness of group dynamics and potential divisions that might undermine collective interests. Sarah returned to the kitchen doorway. "The others are ready when you are." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement. "Bring them, up one at a time, starting with Lyle. Maintain appropriate precautions throughout." As Sarah disappeared to retrieve the next Blackwood brother, Cooper moved closer to the table, his voice pitched for Eleanor's ears alone. "Carson's men will return by tomorrow noon at latest. Jenkins isn't the type to delegate security concerns when women's safety is involved." This practical observation, reminding them of external timelines affecting their situation, demonstrated Cooper's continuing focus on operational security despite 30 years of civilian life. Like Eleanor, he had maintained awareness of potential complications that might disrupt carefully established routines. "Understood," Eleanor replied equally quietly. "All the more reason to reach resolution before outside factors introduce variables beyond our control." Victor, observing this exchange without hearing specific content, noted the practiced coordination between Eleanor and Cooper, the subtle communication of partners who had worked together long enough to develop shorthand understanding. This wasn't merely a former leader and lieutenant reunited by circumstance, but an operational team reactivating long-dormant but still effective protocols. Lyle emerged from the root cellar under Sarah's watchful supervision, his expression controlled, despite the indignity of bonds and captivity. As he was secured to another kitchen chair, his gaze assessed the new addition to their discussion with professional interest. "Mr. Cooper," Eleanor introduced as Lyle was positioned. "Formerly Nathan Collier of the Shadow Fox gang. He'll be participating in our expanded conversation regarding possible resolutions to our current situation." Lyle nodded acknowledgement, his natural diplomacy evident even in adverse circumstances. "A pleasure, despite the situation. Your reputation for strategic planning was well documented, even in sanitized historical accounts." This courteous recognition, acknowledging Cooper's historical significance beyond mere association with Eleanor, reflected Lyle's inherent understanding of human psychology. Even in captivity, he instinctively established connections that might facilitate more favorable outcomes. Franklin followed shortly after, his massive frame requiring more careful navigation of the narrow root cellar stairs. Unlike his brothers, he made no attempt at civil acknowledgement as Cooper was introduced, his expression remaining sullenly hostile as he was secured to a third kitchen chair. "Your cooperation simplifies matters considerably," Eleanor observed as Franklin tested his bonds with obvious frustration. Continued resistance would necessitate additional measures that benefit no one at this juncture. Mason arrived next, his analytical gaze immediately cataloguing details of the kitchen that had been obscured during their pre-dawn confrontation. The tracker's observational skills, honed through years of reading subtle signs in wilderness environments, now applied themselves to the human terrain before him, noting positions, relationships, and potential advantage points with professional detachment. Thomas emerged last, his expression reflecting complex emotions as he rejoined the expanded gathering. Unlike his initial capture, where confusion and fear had dominated his reactions, he now demonstrated thoughtful assessment closer to Victor's measured approach than Franklin's reactive anger. With all 5 Blackwood brothers assembled in Eleanor's kitchen, secured but positioned for conversation rather than mere containment, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. This was no longer simply captors monitoring prisoners, but a deliberate council convened to address circumstances affecting all parties involved. "Gentlemen," Eleanor began, her posture reflecting the natural authority that had once led the most. successful outlaw gang in Western history. Our situation has evolved beyond initial confrontation toward necessary resolution. Mr. Cooper's arrival provides additional perspective regarding potential paths forward, particularly those benefiting mutual interests rather than satisfying immediate impulses. Victor, recognizing the formal commencement of structured negotiation, responded with equal seriousness. We acknowledge changed circumstances and remain open to discussion, with the understanding that any resolution must address the welfare of all 5 Blackwood brothers as a collective unit. This opening position, immediately establishing family solidarity as a non-negotiable element, demonstrated Victor's negotiating approach. Rather than beginning with specific demands or concessions, he first established boundaries within which productive conversation could proceed. Family loyalty is admirable, Eleanor acknowledged, though it presupposes equivalent responsibility across all members. Your brothers' varied roles in your operations and their distinct choices leading to your current circumstances might suggest differentiated rather than uniform consideration. This counterpoint, subtly introducing the concept of individualized treatment based on specific actions rather than collective identity, represented Eleanor's initial negotiating thrust. By questioning the premise of uniform treatment, she created space for more nuanced resolution than all-or-nothing approaches would permit. Franklin shifted restlessly in his bonds. "We ain't here to debate philosophy, old woman. Either name your price or get on with whatever you're planning. Pretty words don't change hard facts." Cooper, who had maintained silent observation until this point, spoke with quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. "Facts include 5 men captured through their own miscalculation, securing of evidence that could send all of you to territorial prison for 20 years minimum, and sufficient resources to implement permanent solutions should cooperation prove unforthcoming." This direct statement of power dynamics, calmly establishing the actual balance of leverage in their situation, demonstrated Cooper's role within their expanded discussion. Where Eleanor might employ philosophical frameworks and Victor strategic positioning, Cooper provided concrete assessment that cut through rhetorical maneuvering. "Yet we remain alive and engaged in conversation rather than secured for delivery to authorities," Lyle observed, his diplomatic instincts identifying the critical implication. "Suggesting mutual advantage exists in alternatives to conventional justice." Eleanor nodded slightly, acknowledging the accurate interpretation. "Perception often creates reality, Mr. Blackwood. Currently, the reality includes multiple potential futures depending on choices made in this room today. Some involving traditional legal consequences, others offering different possibilities altogether." Mason, who had been scanning the kitchen with professional assessment throughout these preliminary exchanges, finally spoke. "You've established defensive positions, supply caches, and escape routes throughout this property over decades. This isn't merely a retirement home, but a strategic position designed for contingency response." This observation, recognizing the military-like preparation underlying Eleanor's seemingly simple homestead, demonstrated Mason's professional respect for the tactical thinking he observed. Despite their adversarial positions, he acknowledged the effectiveness of Eleanor's long-term security planning. "Preparation has defined my existence since Laramie Crossing," Eleanor confirmed. "Though I hoped certain contingencies would never materialize, I never confused hope with strategy." Thomas, who had remained silent until this point, finally spoke with quiet intensity that drew everyone's attention. "You're offering us something beyond simple capture or release, something that relates to your own transition 30 years ago. This insight, connecting their current predicament to Eleanor's historical transformation from outlaw to civilian, demonstrated Thomas's unusual perceptiveness. While his brothers focused on immediate power dynamics, he identified the deeper pattern underlying Eleanor's approach to their situation. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing beyond mild interest, but her eyes sharpened as she regarded the youngest. "Blackwood." "Perceptive observation, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate on your thinking for everyone's benefit." Thomas straightened slightly despite his bonds, demonstrating surprising confidence given his previously subordinate role among his brothers. "You recreated yourself after Laramie Crossing, built an identity, established security protocols, integrated into a community while maintaining necessary vigilance. Your entire existence here represents successful navigation of the transition we've been attempting through less sophisticated means." This articulation, recognizing Eleanor's 30 years in Clearwater Valley as a masterclass in precisely what the Blackwoods had been seeking through their final gold heist, shifted the conversational dynamic dramatically. Thomas had identified the underlying pattern connecting captors and captives beyond their immediate adversarial positions. Victor studied his youngest brother with new appreciation, recognizing the strategic significance of this reframing. "You're suggesting we might learn from their example, rather than merely negotiating temporary advantage." "I'm suggesting," Thomas replied carefully, "that 30 years of successful disappearance represents expertise worth considering, regardless of how we ultimately resolve our current circumstances." Eleanor and Cooper exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken communication, the silent coordination of partners who had navigated dangerous waters together for decades. Whatever they had privately discussed before this expanded conversation, Thomas's observation had introduced new possibilities neither had explicitly considered. "An interesting perspective," Eleanor acknowledged finally. "One that expands potential resolutions beyond conventional frameworks." The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through Eleanor's kitchen windows and illuminating the extraordinary gathering within. Legendary outlaws from two different eras, separated by decades of history, but united by the fundamental challenges of survival in changing times. Whatever resolution emerged from their continued discussion would shape not just immediate fates, but legacy implications extending far beyond Clearwater Valley. 3 days later, as twilight settled over Clearwater Valley, Eleanor Wade stood on her porch, watching the last hints of sunlight fade from the mountain peaks to the west. The past 72 hours had unfolded with the careful orchestration of a master strategist, each development building upon previous groundwork, each decision reflecting decades of hard-won wisdom about survival and adaptation. Inside the house, Sarah and Cooper were completing final preparations for what would unfold after darkness fully claimed the valley. Their movements carried the practiced efficiency of people executing carefully considered plans rather than responding to crisis, the hallmark of Eleanor's operational methodology throughout her extraordinary life. "The wagon is loaded," Cooper reported, joining Eleanor on the porch. "Documentation secured in the false compartment beneath the driver's seat. First stage arrangements confirmed through my contact in Helena." Eleanor nodded acknowledgement, her eyes still fixed on the darkening landscape. "And our other preparations?" Sarah's, handling final details now. "Everything proceeds according to the framework we established." This measured exchange, professional partners confirming operational readiness, reflected the remarkable transition that had occurred since their expanded conversation with the Blackwood brothers 3 days earlier. What had begun as confrontation between captors and captives had evolved into something far more complex, a negotiated resolution that served multiple interests beyond simple victory or defeat. The door opened behind them as Sarah emerged, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Supply packages are complete, 6 months' worth for each, distributed according to protocol. Medical kit for Mason's shoulder, included with appropriate instructions," Eleanor turned toward her young companion, studying her with thoughtful assessment. "You're certain about your role in this? There's still time to adjust arrangements if you've reconsidered." Sarah's expression revealed determination beyond her years. "My decision stands. The opportunity justifies the risks." This cryptic exchange, suggesting Sarah's active participation in whatever arrangement had been negotiated, hinted at complications beyond simple resolution of the immediate crisis. Whatever had been decided clearly involved ongoing connections, rather than final separation between all parties involved. Cooper checked his pocket watch, the gesture illuminated by the last ambient light of fading day. Sheriff Bannerman returned early. Jenkins rode up from Carson's ranch an hour ago to spread word. By morning, he'll be making his rounds through the valley, investigating reports of strangers passing through during the storm. This information, the accelerated return of local law enforcement, added urgency to their timeline without disrupting their composed execution. Like experienced chess players anticipating opponent movements, they had incorporated such possibilities into their planning. "Then we proceed as arranged," Eleanor concluded. "Thomas first, as agreed, the others at 30-minute intervals thereafter." As if summoned by her words, the youngest Blackwood brother emerged from the barn, carrying a small bundle of personal belongings. Unlike his initial arrival days earlier, Thomas now moved with the purposeful confidence of someone embarking on a chosen path rather than following others' leads. "Mrs. Wade," he acknowledged, approaching the porch steps. "Everything's prepared according to your instructions. Victor asked me to convey his respect for your thoroughness despite his initial reservations about certain details." Eleanor smiled faintly at this diplomatic phrasing. "Your eldest brother maintains healthy skepticism, a valuable trait that's likely contributed to your family's survival through challenging circumstances." This acknowledgement, recognizing virtue in an adversary despite their conflicting interests, demonstrated the complex resolution that had emerged from their extended negotiations. Whatever arrangement had been reached clearly involved mutual respect rather than simple domination by either party. Thomas glanced toward the house, his expression revealing a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Is Sarah ready?" Victor emphasized. "The importance of maintaining our established timeline once departures begin." Before Eleanor could respond, Sarah emerged from the house carrying a leather satchel and wearing practical traveling clothes rather than her usual homestead attire. Her revolver was holstered at her hip, not concealed as during the initial confrontation, but openly carried like a standard travel precaution on frontier journeys. "Ready," she confirmed, descending the porch steps to join Thomas. "Cooper's contact will meet us at the arranged location. From there, we follow the schedule exactly as planned." This development, Sarah apparently departing with Thomas rather than remaining with Eleanor, represented an unexpected dimension to whatever resolution had been negotiated. The young woman who had been presented as Eleanor's niece was clearly undertaking some role beyond the homestead's boundaries. Eleanor approached Sarah, her composed expression revealing subtle emotion as she adjusted the younger woman's collar. With maternal attention to detail, "Remember everything we've discussed. Observation before action. Multiple contingencies for every decision. Trust earned rather than assumed." "I remember," Sarah assured her, the exchange carrying weight beyond simple travel precautions. 2 years of preparation doesn't vanish overnight. Besides, we'll have communications established within 3 weeks as arranged." Cooper approached, handing Thomas a sealed envelope. "Directions to the secondary rendezvous if primary arrangements fail. Memorize, then destroy before crossing the territorial line." Thomas accepted the envelope with the seriousness it warranted. "Understood. Victor and the others know to expect modified protocols if we don't establish the signal by the arranged date." These exchanges, laden with operational security measures and contingency planning, revealed that whatever resolution had emerged from their confrontation involved coordinated movement rather than simple separation. The Blackwood brothers weren't merely being released. They were being incorporated into some larger framework that extended beyond immediate circumstances. "You should move now," Eleanor advised, glancing toward the eastern ridge where moonrise would soon provide additional illumination. The trail to Miller's Junction remains clear of patrols until midnight, but margins of safety diminish with each passing hour. Sarah embraced Eleanor with genuine emotion, the brief moment revealing the depth of connection between them despite their apparent decision to separate. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. The teaching, the trust, the opportunity to choose my own path. Your father would be proud," Eleanor replied softly. "As am I." This personal exchange, referencing Sarah's father in connection with their relationship, revealed dimensions beyond the practical partnership they had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Whatever bond united them clearly involved family connection beyond their presented roles as aunt and niece. As Sarah and Thomas mounted horses Cooper had prepared, different animals than those the Blackwoods had arrived on, with unmarked saddles and nondescript equipment, Eleanor offered final guidance. "Follow the route exactly as mapped. No deviations, no matter how tempting alternative paths might appear. The arrangements depend on precise timing at each transition point." "We'll honor the agreement," Thomas assured her, his expression revealing newfound maturity beyond his years. "All of us will. Victor gave his word, and whatever else might be said about my brother, he never breaks a promise once genuinely made." With that solemn assurance, Sarah and Thomas urged their mounts forward, disappearing into the gathering darkness of the valley trail. Eleanor and Cooper watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, leaving only night sounds and the distant call of an owl hunting in the meadow below. "She'll be fine," Cooper observed quietly. "The girl has your instincts for danger, and twice your patience for planning, better equipped for this transition than either of us were at Laramie." Eleanor nodded slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on the trail where Sarah had disappeared. Different circumstances require different preparations. Our generation fumbled through necessity, hers benefits from lessons already learned. This philosophical assessment, acknowledging the evolutionary nature of their knowledge across generations, reflected Eleanor's lifelong capacity for contextual thinking. Even personal transitions were situated within historical frameworks that gave them meaning beyond immediate emotions. "Victor next?" Cooper asked, returning their focus to operational execution after this moment of reflection. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, "though I expect he'll want additional assurances regarding our remaining commitments once his brothers are beyond immediate jurisdiction." As Cooper returned to the barn to prepare for the next departure, Eleanor remained on the porch, her gaze shifting toward the western ridge where distant lights marked neighboring homesteads across the valley. For 30 years, she had maintained her position in this community, respected widow Eleanor Wade, tending her modest property, exchanging preserves with neighbors, attending church services with appropriate regularity. That identity remained intact despite the extraordinary events of recent days. Whatever resolution had been negotiated with the Blackwoods clearly preserved the careful construction of her public persona, while accommodating the reality of her discovered past. Inside the house, limited sounds suggested the remaining Blackwood. Brothers were preparing for their staged departures, Victor's measured movements contrasting with Franklin's heavier tread as they gathered whatever possessions had been arranged as part of their agreement. When Victor emerged onto the porch, 20 minutes later, his appearance had been subtly transformed. Gone was the distinctive scarred face that might trigger recognition. Careful application of stage makeup, another skill from the Shadow Fox gang's operational toolkit, had altered his features just enough to pass casual inspection without drawing attention to the disguise itself. "Impressive work," he acknowledged, touching the altered appearance of his most identifiable feature. "I understand this was a specialty within your former organization." Eleanor nodded slightly. "Catherine Mills studied with a theatrical company before joining us, taught several of us techniques that proved valuable during certain operations. The materials provided will allow maintenance for approximately 2 weeks, sufficient time to reach the arrangements in Wyoming." Victor studied Eleanor with thoughtful assessment, their adversarial beginning having evolved into something approaching professional respect. "You've considered everything, haven't you? Down to details that wouldn't occur to most planning major transitions." "Experience provides perspective," Eleanor replied simply. "The mistakes I made after Laramie Crossing taught lessons I'm sharing through these arrangements. Whether you utilize that knowledge effectively remains your choice." This straightforward exchange, acknowledging the transfer of expertise without guaranteeing outcomes, characterized the pragmatic resolution they had negotiated. Eleanor had provided frameworks and resources. How the Blackwoods applied them would determine their ultimate success or failure. "The gold?" Victor asked, the question inevitable despite its belated appearance in their conversation. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing beyond mild interest. "Distributed according to our agreement. The first portion awaits at the location Cooper provided. Subsequent transfers depend on compliance with established protocols." This confirmation that the legendary Western Pacific gold had indeed been incorporated into their negotiated resolution explained the Blackwoods' willingness to accept Eleanor's terms despite their initial positioning. The treasure they had come seeking would partially be theirs, though clearly under conditions that served Eleanor's interests as well. "And Sarah?" Victor pressed, his tone suggesting genuine rather than tactical concern. "Thomas hasn't fully explained her role in these arrangements." Eleanor considered her response carefully, weighing various implications before answering. "Sarah makes her own choices, as she has since arriving in Clearwater Valley 2 years ago. Her decision to accompany Thomas reflects assessment of opportunities rather than obligation to either of us." This measured response, neither confirming nor denying specific arrangements between Sarah and Thomas, maintained operational security while acknowledging the young woman's autonomy within their complex resolution. Victor seemed to accept this limited explanation, recognizing boundaries that wouldn't be crossed even within their negotiated cooperation. "Fair enough. We'll honor our commitments regarding her safety, regardless of specific arrangements." Cooper returned from the barn leading another horse, this one saddled for Victor's departure. Like the mounts Thomas and Sarah had taken, this animal bore no distinctive markings and carried equipment that would draw no particular attention from casual observers along the trail. "Your brothers will follow at the intervals we established," Eleanor informed Victor as he prepared to mount, each taking separate routes initially, converging at the primary location only after confirming absence of pursuit or observation. Victor swung into the saddle with practiced ease despite his recent confinement. Mason expressed particular appreciation for the detailed maps. "Apparently, your knowledge of unmonitored passages through these territories exceeds even his considerable experience. 30 years of observation combined with previous operational knowledge," Eleanor acknowledged, without false modesty. "The territories change, but certain principles of movement remain constant for those paying proper attention." As Victor gathered his reins preparing for departure, he offered a final observation that reflected the extraordinary evolution of their relationship from confrontation to negotiated resolution. Shadow Fox Hudson disappeared after Laramie Crossing, transforming into Eleanor Wade through careful planning and strategic execution. Perhaps the Blackwood brothers might similarly vanish, leaving only stories and speculation behind while different men build new lives elsewhere. Eleanor's smile held genuine appreciation for this elegant summation of their fundamental agreement. History often provides useful patterns for those willing to study its implications, Mr. Blackwood. Safe journey. With that simple benediction, Victor Blackwood departed into the darkness, following a different trail than his youngest brother had taken with Sarah. The careful separation, another security measure within Eleanor's comprehensive arrangements. Over. The next 90 minutes, Lyle, Franklin, and finally Mason departed at the established intervals, each following distinct routes according to Eleanor's detailed instructions. By midnight, all 5 Blackwood brothers had vanished into the Montana night, their ultimate destinations known only to those directly involved in the carefully orchestrated disappearance. As the last hoofbeats faded into distance, Cooper rejoined, Eleanor on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. They sat in the comfortable silence of partners who had navigated extraordinary circumstances together, not just in recent days, but across decades of shared history. "Will it work?" Cooper asked finally, the question addressing more than merely the Blackwoods' immediate departure. Eleanor considered this larger inquiry with characteristic thoughtfulness. "The framework is sound, the resources sufficient, the motivations aligned, with necessary outcomes. Beyond that, success depends on execution beyond our direct control." This measured assessment, acknowledging both possibility and limitation, reflected Eleanor's lifelong approach to strategic thinking. She created conditions favorable to desired outcomes without presuming certainty in complex human situations. "And, Sarah?" Cooper pressed gently, knowing the young woman's departure represented significant personal adjustment beyond operational considerations. Eleanor's expression softened slightly at the mention of her protégé. Sarah Harrison made her choice with full understanding of both opportunities and risks, just as her father would have wanted. This reference, using Sarah's actual surname for the first time, confirmed the personal connection only hinted at in earlier exchanges. The young woman who had been presented as Eleanor's niece clearly had deeper significance within the former outlaw's carefully constructed life. "Michael would be proud of how you've guided her," Cooper observed quietly, "though I doubt he ever imagined his daughter would eventually partner with the youngest Blackwood in establishing new identities beyond territorial reach." Eleanor smiled faintly at this observation. "Life creates unexpected connections, Nathan. You and I learned that lesson decades ago at Laramie Crossing." The reference to their shared past, using Cooper's original name in this moment of private reflection, acknowledged the personal dimension that had always existed beneath their professional partnership. Whatever bound these former outlaws extended beyond tactical alignment into deeper emotional territory, seldom revealed to others. "Sheriff Bannerman will arrive by mid-morning," Cooper noted, returning their conversation to practical considerations. "His questions about strangers during the storm will require carefully constructed responses, already prepared," Eleanor assured him. Consistent with reports from Carson's ranch hands, acknowledging tracks observed but attributing them to riders passing through during the storm's peak. Nothing to connect those observations with either the Blackwood gang or subsequent disappearances. This attention to narrative consistency, ensuring all public accounts aligned without raising additional questions, demonstrated the meticulous planning that had protected Eleanor's constructed identity for 30 years. Even when incorporating 5 notorious outlaws into her operational framework, she maintained disciplined focus on preserving her established position within Clearwater Valley. "And the gold?" Cooper asked, the question inevitable between former partners who had once orchestrated the legendary robbery that created Eleanor's financial foundation. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing beyond mild contemplation as she sipped her coffee, distributed according to established agreements. The Blackwoods receive enough to establish legitimate enterprises in their new identities. We retain sufficient resources to implement the contingency we've discussed since Sarah's arrival 2 years ago. This cryptic reference, suggesting long-term planning beyond recent crisis response, hinted at dimensions to Eleanor and Cooper's ongoing partnership not revealed during their negotiations with the Blackwoods. Whatever resolution they had orchestrated clearly served multiple objectives beyond merely managing immediate circumstances. The Carson property comes available next month when they relocate to Oregon, Cooper observed, apparently following a conversational thread established in previous discussions. Ideal positioning for expanded operations while maintaining your established presence here. Eleanor nodded agreement. Sarah will manage initial arrangements from Wyoming once the Blackwoods transition is stabilized. Your contact in Helena has prepared the necessary documentation for ownership transfer through the corporate entity we established last year. These exchanges, revealing sophisticated financial and property arrangements extending far beyond simple homesteading, illuminated the complex reality beneath Eleanor Wade's public persona. The former Shadow Fox hadn't merely hidden for 30 years. She had built an invisible network of resources and connections that operated beneath the surface of frontier society. A new chapter begins, Cooper observed, gesturing toward the star-filled sky above Clearwater Valley. Though perhaps less dramatic than our transition after Laramie Crossing, Eleanor's smile held the weight of decades spent navigating between worlds, the legendary outlaw she had been and the respected widow she had become, now evolving into something that incorporated elements of both while transcending simple categories. Every worthy story contains multiple chapters, Nathan, she replied, with the philosophical perspective that had always distinguished her approach to life's complexities. The artistry lies in how they connect, rather than their individual dramatic qualities. As night deepened around Eleanor Wade's homestead, nothing visible suggested the extraordinary events that had unfolded within its boundaries over recent days. To casual observation, it remained simply the modest property of a long-time valley resident, a widow of advancing years, living quietly with her niece, occasionally receiving visits from the blacksmith in the settlement eastward. By morning, Sheriff Bannerman would arrive asking questions about strangers during the storm, receiving carefully constructed answers that revealed nothing of significance. Within weeks, Sarah's absence would be explained through plausible stories about visiting distant relatives that neighborhood gossip would accept without serious question. The Blackwood brothers would vanish from territorial wanted posters, their disappearance becoming another frontier mystery alongside countless others, men who rode into history, leaving only speculation about their ultimate fates. In their place, new identities would establish businesses in distant locations, their connection to notorious outlaws invisible to all but those directly involved in their transformation. And Eleanor Hudson, once the legendary Shadow Fox, now the respected Eleanor Wade, would continue her extraordinary journey, adapting once again to changed circumstances, while maintaining the core principles that had guided her since tragedy first transformed a Boston banker's wife into the most successful outlaw leader in Western history. Beneath the vast Montana sky, as the Shadow Fox of legend and the widow of Clearwater Valley merged into something transcending both identities, Eleanor sipped her coffee and contemplated futures still unfolding from choices made decades earlier, the complex legacy of a woman who had always understood that survival required not just courage, but the wisdom to recognize when transformation offered better prospects than mere resistance against changing times. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.